Gliding through the blackness of deep space, the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera pointed its mighty arrowhead shape toward the dim star of its target system, 3 thousandths of a light year away, and prepared itself for war. All systems show battle ready, Admiral, the comm officer reported from the portside crew pit. The task force is beginning to check in. Very good, Lieutenant. Grand Admiral Thrawn nodded. Inform me when all have done so. Captain Palaeon? Sir? Palaeon said, searching his superior's face for the stress the Grand Admiral must be feeling, the stress he himself was certainly feeling. This was not just another tactical strike against the rebellion, after all. Not a minor shipping raid or even a complex but straightforward hit and fade against some insignificant planetary base. After nearly a month of frenzied preparations, Thrawn's master campaign for the Empire's final victory was about to be launched. But if the Grand Admiral was feeling any tension, he was keeping it to himself. Begin the countdown, he told Palaeon, his voice as calm as if he were ordering dinner. Yes, sir, Palaeon said, turning back to the group of one-quarter-size holographic figures standing before him in the Chimera's aft-bridge hologram pod. Gentlemen, launch marks. Bellicos, 3 minutes. Acknowledged, Chimera, Captain Aban nodded, his proper military demeanor not quite masking his eagerness to take this war back to the rebellion. Good hunting. The hollow image sputtered and vanished as the Bellicos raised its deflector shields, cutting off long-range communications. Palaeon shifted his attention to the next image in line. Relentless, 4.5 minutes. Acknowledged, Captain Dorger said, cupping his right fist in his left in an ancient Mershaft gesture of victory as he, too, vanished from the hologram pod. Palaeon glanced at his datapad. Judicator, 6 minutes. We're ready, Chimera, Captain Brandi said, his voice soft and just a little bit wrong. Palaeon frowned at him. Quarter-sized hollows didn't show a lot of detail, but even so, the expression on Brandi's face was easy to read. It was the expression of a man out for blood. This is war, Captain Brandi, Thrawn said, coming up silently to Palaeon's side. Not an opportunity for personal revenge. I understand my duty, Admiral, Brandi said stiffly. Thrawn's blue-black eyebrows lifted slightly. Do you, Captain? Do you indeed? Slowly, reluctantly, some of the fire faded from Brandi's face. Yes, sir, he muttered. My duty is to the Empire, and to you, and to the ships and crews under my command. Very good, Thrawn said. To the living, in other words. Not to the dead. Brandi was still glowering, but he gave a dutiful nod. Yes, sir. Never forget that, Captain, Thrawn warned him. The fortunes of war rise and fall, and you may be assured that the rebellion will be repaid in full for their destruction of the peremptory at the Katana Fleet skirmish, but that repayment will occur in the context of our overall strategy, not as an act of private vengeance. His glowing red eyes narrowed slightly. Certainly not by any fleet captain under my command. I trust I make myself clear. Brandi's cheek twitched. Palaeon had never thought of the man as brilliant, but he was smart enough to recognize a threat when he heard one. Very clear, Admiral. Good. Thrawn eyed him a moment longer, then nodded. I believe you've been given your launch mark. Yes, sir. Judicator out. Thrawn looked at Palaeon. Continue, Captain, he said, and turned away. Yes, sir. Palaeon looked at his datapad. Nemesis. He finished the list without further incident. By the time the last hollow image disappeared, the final check-in from their own task force was complete. The timetable appears to be running smoothly, Thrawn said as Palaeon returned to his command station. The Stormhawk reports that the guide fleet has launched on time with tow cables functioning properly, and we've just intercepted a general emergency call from the Ando system. The Bellicose and its task force right on schedule. Any response, sir? Palaeon asked. The rebel base at Old Padron acknowledged, Thrawn said. It should be interesting to see how much help they send. Palaeon nodded. The rebels had seen enough of Thrawn's tactics by now to expect Ando to be a feint, and to respond accordingly, but on the other hand, an attack force consisting of an Imperial Star Destroyer and 8 Katana Fleet dreadnoughts was hardly something they could afford to dismiss out of hand either. Not that it really mattered. They would send a few ships to Ando to fight the Bellicose, and a few more to Filv to fight the Judicator, and a few more to Crondre to fight the Nemesis, and so on and so on. By the time the Death's Head hit the base itself, Ord Padron would be down to a skeleton defense and screaming itself for all the reinforcements the rebellion could scramble. And that was where those reinforcements would go, leaving the Empire's true target ripe for the picking. Palaeon looked out the forward viewport at the star of the Ukio system dead ahead, his throat tightening as he contemplated again the enormous conceit of this whole plan. With planetary shields able to hold off all but the most massive turbo laser and proton torpedo bombardment, conventional wisdom held that the only way to subdue a modern world was to put a fast-moving ground force down at the edges and send them overland to destroy the shield generators. Between the fire laid down by the ground force and the subsequent orbital assault, the target world was always badly damaged by the time it was finally taken. The alternative, landing hundreds of thousands of troops in a major ground campaign that could stretch into months or years, was no better. To capture a planet relatively undamaged but with shield generators still intact was considered an impossibility. That bit of military wisdom would fall today, along with Yukio itself. "Intercepted distress signal from the field, Admiral," the comm officer reported. "AODiobook again responding." "Good." Thrawn consulted his chrono. 7 minutes, I think, and we'll be able to move. His lips compressed just noticeably. "I suppose we'd better confirm that our exalted Jedi Master is ready to do his part." Palaon hid a grimace. Joruus C'baoth, insane clone of the long-dead Jedi Master Joruus C'baoth, who a month ago had proclaimed himself the true heir to the Empire. He didn't like talking to the man any more than Thrawn did, but he might as well volunteer. If he didn't, it would simply become an order. "I'll go, sir," he said, standing up. "Thank you, Captain," Thrawn said, as if Palaon would have had a choice. He felt the mental summons the moment he stepped beyond the force protection of the Asala Miri scattered about the bridge on their nutrient frames. Master C'baoth clearly was impatient for the operation to begin. Preparing himself as best he could, fighting against C'baoth's casual mental pressure to hurry, Palaon made his way down to Thrawn's command room. The chamber was brightly lit, in marked contrast to the subdued lighting the Grand Admiral usually preferred. "Captain Palaon," C'baoth called, beckoning to him from the double display ring in the center of the room. "Come in. I've been waiting for you." "The rest of the operation has taken my full attention," Palaon told him stiffly, trying to hide his distaste for the man, knowing full well how futile such attempts were. "Of course," C'baoth smiled, a smile that showed more effectively than any words his amusement with Palaon's discomfort. "No matter. I take it Grand Admiral Thrawn is finally ready." "Almost," Palaon said. "We want to clear out AODiobook as much as possible before we move." C'baoth snorted. "You continue to assume the New Republic will dance to the Grand Admiral's tune." "They will," Palaon said. "The Grand Admiral has studied the enemy thoroughly." "He studied their artwork," C'baoth countered with another snort. "That will be useful if the time ever comes when the New Republic has nothing but artists left to throw against us." A signal from the display ring saved Palaon from the need to reply. "We're moving," he told C'baoth, starting a mental countdown of the 76 seconds it would take to reach the Yukio system from their position and trying not to let C'baoth's words get under his skin. He didn't understand himself how Thrawn could so accurately learn the innermost secrets of a species from its artwork, but he'd seen that knowledge proved often enough to trust the Grand Admiral's instincts on such things. C'baoth hadn't. But then C'baoth wasn't really interested in an honest debate on the subject. For the past month, ever since declaring himself to be the true heir to the Emperor, C'baoth had been pressing this quiet war against Thrawn's credibility, implying that true insight came only through the Force, and therefore only through him. Palaon himself didn't buy that argument. The Emperor had been deep into this Force thing too, and he hadn't even been able to predict his own death at Endor. But the seeds of uncertainty C'baoth was trying to sow were nevertheless starting to take hold, particularly among the less experienced of Thrawn's officers, which was, for Palaon, just one more reason why this attack had to succeed. The outcome hinged as much on Thrawn's reading of the Yukian cultural ethos as it did on straight military tactics, on Thrawn's conviction that, at a basic psychological level, the Yukians were terrified of the impossible. "He will not always be right," C'baoth said into Palaon's musings. Palaon bit down hard on the inside of his cheek, the skin of his back crawling at having had his thoughts so casually invaded. "You don't have any concept of privacy, do you?" he growled. "I am the Empire, Captain Palaon," C'baoth said, his eyes glowing with a dark fanatical fire. "Your thoughts are a part of your service to me." "My service is to Grand Admiral Thrawn," Palaon said stiffly. C'baoth smiled. "You may believe that if you wish. But to business. True Imperial business. When the battle here is over, Captain Palaon, I want a message sent to Wayland. Announcing your imminent return, no doubt," Palaon said sourly. C'baoth had been insisting for nearly a month now that he would soon be going back to his former home on Wayland, where he would take command of the cloning facility in the Emperor's old storehouse inside Mount Tantus. So far he'd been too busy trying to subvert Thrawn's position to do anything more than talk about it. "Do not worry, Captain Palaon," C'baoth said. all amused again. "When the time is right, I will indeed return to Wayland, which is why you will contact Wayland after this battle is over and order them to create a clone for me. A very special clone. Grand Admiral Thrawn will have to authorize that," were the words that came to mind. "What kind do you want?" were the ones that inexplicably came out. Palayon blinked, running the memory over in his mind again. Yes, that was what he'd said, all right. Zverev smiled again at his silent confusion. "I merely wish a servant," he said. "Someone who will be waiting there for me when I return. Formed from one of the Emperor's prized souvenirs. Sample B-2332-54, I believe it was. You will, of course, impress upon the garrison commander there that this must be done in total secrecy." "I will do nothing of the sort." "Yes," Palayon heard himself say instead. The sound of the word shocked him, but certainly he didn't mean it. On the contrary, as soon as the battle was over, he'd be reporting this little incident directly to Thrawn. "You'll also keep this conversation a private matter between ourselves," C'baoth said lazily. "Once you have obeyed, you will forget it even happened." "Of course," Palayon nodded, just to shut him up. Yes, he'd report this to Thrawn, all right. The Grand Admiral will know what to do. The countdown reached 0, and on the main wall display the planet Yukio appeared. "We should put up a tactical display, Master C'baoth," he said. C'baoth waved a hand. "As you wish." Palayon reached over the double display ring and touched the proper key, and in the center of the room, the holographic tactical display appeared. The Chimera was driving toward high orbit above the sun-side equator. The 10 Katana fleet dreadnoughts of its task force were splitting up into outer and inner defense positions, and the Stormhawk was coming in as backstop from the night side. Other ships, mostly freighters and other commercial types, could be seen dropping through the brief gap's ground controls, opening for them in Yukio's energy shield, a hazy blue shell surrounding the planet about 50 kilometers above the surface. 2 of the blips flashed red, the guide freighters from the Stormhawk, looking as innocent as all the rest of the ships scurrying madly for cover. The freighters and the 4 invisible companions they towed. "Invisible only to those without eyes to see them," C'baoth murmured. "So now you can see the ships themselves, can you?" Palayon growled. "How Jedi skills grow." He'd been hoping to irritate C'baoth a little. Not much, just a little, but it was a futile effort. "I can see the men inside your precious cloaking shields," the Jedi Master said placidly. "I can see their thoughts and guide their wills. What does the metal itself matter?" Palayon felt his lip twist. "I suppose there's a lot that doesn't matter to you," he said. From the corner of his eye he saw C'baoth smile. What doesn't matter to a Jedi Master does not matter to the universe. The freighters and cloaked cruisers were nearly to the shield now. "They'll be dropping the tow cables as soon as they're inside the shield," Palayon reminded C'baoth. "Are you ready?" The Jedi Master straightened up in his seat and closed his eyes to slits. "I await the Grand Admiral's command," he said sardonically. For another second, Palayon looked at the other's composed expression, a shiver running up through him. He could remember vividly the first time C'baoth had tried this kind of direct long-distance control, could remember the pain that had been on C'baoth's face, the pinched look of concentration and agony as he struggled to hold the mental contacts. Barely 2 months ago, Thrawn had confidently said that C'baoth would never be a threat to the Empire because he lacked the ability to focus and concentrate his Jedi power on a long-term basis. Somehow, between that time and now, C'baoth had obviously succeeded in learning the necessary control, which left C'baoth as a threat to the Empire. A very dangerous threat indeed. The intercom beeped. "Captain Palayon?" Palayon reached over the display ring and touched the key, pushing away his fears about C'baoth as best he could. For the moment, at least, the fleet needed C'baoth. Fortunately, perhaps, C'baoth also needed the fleet. "We're ready, Admiral," he said. "Stand by," Thrawn said. "Tow cables detaching now." "They are free," C'baoth said. "They are under power, moving now to their appointed positions." "Confirm that they're beneath the planetary shield," Thrawn ordered. For the first time, a hint of the old strain crossed C'baoth's face. Hardly surprising, with the cloaking shield preventing the Chimera from seeing the cruisers, and at the same time blinding the cruisers' own senses, the only way to know exactly where they were was for C'baoth to do a precise location check on the mines he was touching. "All 4 ships are beneath the shield," he said. "Be absolutely certain, Jedi Master. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong, Grand Admiral Thrawn," C'baoth cut him off harshly. "I will do my part in this battle. Concern yourself with yours." For a moment the intercom was silent. Palayon winced, visualizing the Grand Admiral's expression. "Very well, Jedi Master," Thrawn said calmly. "Prepare to do your part." There was the double click of an opening comm channel. "This is the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, calling the Overliege of Yukio," Thrawn said. "In the name of the Empire, I declare the Yukian system to be once again under the mandate of Imperial law and the protection of Imperial forces. You will lower your shields, recall all military units to their bases, and prepare for an orderly transfer of command. There was no response. I know you're receiving this message, Thrawn continued. If you fail to respond, I will have to assume that you mean to resist the Empire's offer. In that event, I would have no choice but to open hostilities. Again, silence. They're sending another transmission, Palaeon heard the comm officer say. Sounds a little more panicked than the first one was. I'm certain their third will be even more so, Thrawn told him. Prepare for firing sequence 1. Master Sabaoth? The cruisers are ready, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Sabaoth said. As am I. Be sure that you are, Thrawn said, quietly threatening. Unless the timing is absolutely perfect, this entire show will be worse than useless. Turbo laser battery free. Stand by firing sequence on 1 on my mark. 3, 2, 1, fire. On the tactical hologram, a double lance of green fire angled out from the Chimera's turbo laser batteries toward the planet below. The blast struck the hazy blue of the planetary shield, splashed slightly as their energy was defocused and reflected back into space. But with the desired perfect timing, the two cloaked cruisers hovering on repulsor lifts beneath the shield at those 2 points fired in turn, their turbo laser blasts sizzling through the atmosphere into 2 of Yukio's major air defense bases. That was what Palaeon saw. The Yukians, if no way of knowing about the cloaked cruisers, would have seen the Chimera fire 2 devastating shots cleanly through an impenetrable planetary shield. Third transmission cut off right in the middle, sir, the comm officer reported with a touch of dark humour. I think we surprised them. Let's convince them it wasn't a fluke, Thrawn said. Prepare firing sequence 2. Master Sabaoth? The cruisers are ready. Turbo laser battery 2. Stand by firing sequence 2 on my mark. 3, 2, 1, fire. Again the green fire lanced out, and again with perfect timing, the cloaked cruisers created their illusion. Well done, Thrawn said. Master Sabaoth, move the cruisers into position for sequences 3 and 4. As you command, Grand Admiral Thrawn. Unconsciously, Palaeon braced himself. Sequence 4 had 2 of the Yukian's 30 overlapping shield generators as its targets. Launching such an attack would mean that Thrawn had given up on his stated goal of taking Yukio with its planetary defenses intact. Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, this is Tol Dosla of the Yukian Overleash. A slightly quavering voice came from the intercom speaker. We would ask you to cease your bombardment of Yukio while we discuss terms for surrender. My terms are quite simple, Thrawn said. You will begin by lowering your planetary shield and allowing my forces to land. They will be given control of the shield generators themselves and of all ground-to-space weaponry. All fighting vehicles larger than command speeders will be moved to designated military bases and turned over to Imperial control. Though you will, of course, be ultimately answerable to the Empire, your political and social systems will remain under your control, provided your people behave themselves, of course. Once these changes have been implemented, then you'll be part of the Empire, with all the rights and duties that implies. There will be no war-level tax levies, Doslar asked suspiciously. No forced conscription of our young people? Palaeon could imagine Thrawn's grim smile. No, the Empire would never need to bother with forced conscription again. Not with the Emperor's collection of Sparty cloning cylinders in their hands. No to your second question, a qualified no to your first, Thrawn told the Yukian. As you are obviously aware, most Imperial worlds are currently under war status taxation levels. However, there are exceptions, and it is likely that your share of the war effort will come directly from your extensive food production and processing facilities. There was a long pause from the other end. Doslar was no fool, Palaeon realized. The Yukian knew full well what Thrawn had in mind for his world. First it would be direct Imperial control of the ground/space defenses, then direct control of the food distribution system, the processing facilities, and the vast farming and livestock grazing regions themselves. In a very short time, the entire planet would have become nothing more than a supply depot for the Imperial war machine. But the alternative was for him to stand silently by and watch as his world was utterly and impossibly demolished before his eyes. And he knew that too. We will lower the planetary shields, Chimera, as a gesture of good faith, Doslar said at last, his tone defiant with a hint of defeat to it. But before the generators and ground/space weaponry can be turned over to Imperial forces, we shall require certain guarantees regarding the safety of the Yukian people and our land. Certainly, Thrawn said, without any trace of the gloating that most Imperial commanders would have indulged in at this point. A small act of courtesy that, Palaeon knew, was as precisely calculated as the rest of the attack had been. Permitting the Yukian leaders to surrender with their dignity intact would slow down the inevitable resistance to Imperial rule until it was too late. A representative will be on his way shortly to discuss the particulars of your government, Thrawn continued. Meanwhile, I presume you have no objection to our forces taking up preliminary defense positions. A sigh, more felt than really heard. We have no objections, Chimera, Doslar said reluctantly. We are lowering this shield now. On the tactical display, the blue haze surrounding the planet faded away. Master Sabaoth, have the cruisers moved to polar positions, Thrawn ordered. We don't want any of the dropships blundering into them. General Covell, you may begin transporting your forces to the surface. Standard defensive positions around all targets. Acknowledged, Admiral, Covell's voice said, a little too dryly, and Pelan felt a tight smile twitch at his lip. It had only been 2 weeks since the top fleet and army commanders had been let in on the secret of the Mount Tantus cloning project, and Covell was one of those who still hadn't adjusted completely to the idea. For the fact that 3 of the companies he was about to lead down to the surface were composed entirely of clones might have had something to do with his skepticism. On the tactical hologram, the first waves of drop ships and TIE fighter escorts had exited the Chimera and Stormhawk, fanning out toward their assigned targets, clones in drop ships about to carry out Imperial orders, as the clone crews and the cloaked cruisers had already done so well. Palaon frowned, an odd and uncomfortable thought suddenly striking him. Had Sabaoth been able to guide the cruisers so well because each of their 1,000-man crews are composed of variants or just 20 or so different minds? Or even more disturbing, could part of the Jedi Master's split-second control have been due to the fact that Sabaoth was himself a clone? And either way, did that mean that the Mount Tantus project was playing directly into Sabaoth's hands in his bid for power? Perhaps. One more question he would have to bring to Thrawn's attention. Palaon looked down at Sabaoth, belatedly remembering that in the Jedi Master's presence such thoughts were not his private property. But Sabaoth wasn't looking at him, knowingly or otherwise. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, the skin of his face taut. A faint smile just beginning to crease his lips. Master Sabaoth? There, Sabaoth whispered, his voice deep and husky. There, he repeated, louder this time. Palaon frowned back at the tactical hologram. Who's where? He asked. They're at Vilv, Sabaoth said. Abruptly, he looked up at Palaon, his eyes bright and insane. My Jedi are at Vilv. Master Sabaoth, confirm that the cruisers have moved to polar positions. Thrawn's voice came sharply. Then report on the faint battles. My Jedi are at Vilv. Sabaoth cut him off. What do I care about your battles? Sabaoth, with a wave of his hand, Sabaoth shut off the intercom. Now, Leia Organa Solo, he murmured softly, you are mine. The Millennium Falcon twisted hard to starboard as a TIE fighter shot past overhead, lasers blazing around madly as it tried unsuccessfully to track the freighter's maneuver. Clenching her teeth firmly against the movement, Leia Organa Solo watched as one of their escort X-Wings blew the Imperial starfighter into a cloud of flaming dust. The sky spun around the Falcon's canopy as the ship rolled back toward its original heading. Look out! 3PO wailed from the seat behind Leia as another TIE fighter roared in toward them from the side. The warning was unnecessary. With deceptive ungainliness, the Falcon was already corkscrewing back the other direction to bring its virtual quad-laser battery to bear. Faintly audible even through the cockpit door, Leia heard the sound of a Wookiee battle roar, and the TIE fighter went the way of its late partner. Good shot, Chewie, Han Solo called into the intercom as he got the Falcon leveled again. Wedge, still with you, Falcon. Wedge Antilles' voice came promptly. We're clear for now, but there's another wave of TIE fighters on the way. Yeah, Han glanced at Leia. It's your call, sweetheart. You still want to try and reach ground? 3PO gave a little electronic gasp. Surely, Captain Solo, you aren't suggesting put a choke valve on a goldenrod. Han cut him off. Leia? Leia looked out the cockpit canopy at the Imperial Star Destroyer and 8 dreadnoughts arrayed against the beleaguered planet ahead, clustering around it like Minox around an unshielded power generator. It was to have been her last diplomatic mission before settling in to await the birth of her twins. A quick trip to calm a nervous Vilvian government and demonstrate the New Republic's determination to protect the systems in this sector. Some demonstration. There's no way we can make it through all that, she told Han reluctantly. Even if we could, I doubt the Vilvians would risk opening the shield to let us in. We'd better make a run for it. Sounds good to me, Han grunted. Wedge, we're pulling out. Stay with us. Copy, Falcon, Wedge said. You'll have to give us a few minutes to calculate the jump back. Don't bother, Han said, swiveling around in his seat to key in the nav computer. We'll feed you the numbers from here. Copy. Rogue Squadron, screen formation. You know, I'm starting to get tired of this, Han told Leia, swiveling back to face front. I thought you said your Noghri pals were going to leave you alone. This has nothing to do with the Noghri. Leia shook her head, an odd half-felt tension stretching at her forehead. Was it her imagination or the Imperial ship surrounding the Vilv starting to break formation? This is Grand Admiral Thrawn playing with his new Dark Force dreadnoughts. Yeah, Han agreed quietly, and Leia winced at the momentary flash of bitterness in his sense. Despite everyone's best efforts to persuade him otherwise, Han still considered it his own personal fault that Thrawn had gotten to the derelict Katana fleet ships, the so-called Dark Force, ahead of the New Republic. I wouldn't have thought he could get them reconditioned this fast, Han added as he twisted the Falcon's nose away from Vilv and back toward deep space. Leia swallowed. The strange tension was still there, like a distant malevolence pressing against the edges of her mind. Maybe he has enough Sparty cylinders to clone some engineers and techs as well as soldiers. That's sure a fun thought, Han said, and through her tension, Leia could sense his sudden change in mood as he tapped the comm switch. Wedge, take a look back at Phil and tell me if I'm seeing things. Over the comm, Leia could hear Wedge's thoughtful intake of air. You mean like the whole Imperial force breaking off their attack and coming after us? Yeah, that. Looks real enough to me, Wedge said. Could be a good time to get out of here. Yeah, Han said slowly. Maybe. Leia frowned at her husband. There'd been something in his voice. Han, the Filvians would have called for help before they put up their shield, right? Han asked her, forehead furrowed with thought. Right, Leia agreed cautiously. And the nearest New Republic base is Ord Padron, right? Right. Okay, Rogue Squadron, we're changing course to starboard. Stay with me. He heaved his board, and the Falcon started a sharp curve to the right. Watch it, Falcon. This is taking us back toward that TIE fighter group, Wedge warned. We're not going that far, Han assured him. Here's our vector. He straightened out the ship onto their new course heading and threw a look at the rear display. Good. They're still chasing us. Behind him, the nav computer beeped its notification and the jump coordinates were ready. Wedge, we've got your coordinates, Leia said, reaching for the data transmission key. Hold it, Falcon, Wedge cut her off. We've got company to starboard. Leia looked that direction, her throat tightening as she saw what Wedge meant. The approaching TIE fighters were coming up fast and already were close enough to eavesdrop on any transmission the Falcon tried to make to its escort. Sending Wedge for jump coordinates now would be an open invitation for the Imperials to have a reception committee waiting at the other end. Perhaps I can be of assistance, Your Highness, 3PO offered brightly. As you know, I am fluent in over 6 million forms of communication. I could transmit the coordinates to Commander Antilles in Bordist or Vafkri trade language, for example, and then you'd send them the translation, Han put in dryly. Of course, the droid broke off. Oh dear, he said, sounding embarrassed. Yeah, well, don't worry about it, Han said. Wedge, you were at Exquine 2 years ago, weren't you? Yes. Ah, a Kraken twist? Right. On 2, 1, 2. Outside the canopy, Leia caught a glimpse of the X-Wing swinging into a complicated new escort formation around the Falcon. What does this buy us? She asked. Our way out, Han told her, checking the rear display again. Pull the coordinates, add a 2 to the second number of each one, and then send the whole package to the X-Wings. I see. Leia nodded her understanding as she got to work. Altering the second digit wouldn't change the appearance of their exit vector enough for the Imperials to catch on to the trick, but it would be more than enough to put any chase force a couple of light years off target. Clever. And that little flight maneuver they did just now was just window dressing? Right. Makes anyone watching think that's all there is to it. A little something Pash Kraken came up with at that fiasco off Psyquine. Han glanced at the rear display again. I think we've got enough lead to outrun them, he said. Let's try. We're not jumping to light speed? Leia frowned, an old and wild painful memory floating up from the back of her mind. The mad scramble away from Hoth, with Darth Vader's whole fleet breathing down their necks, and a hyperdrive that turned out to be broken. Han threw her a sideways look. Don't worry, sweetheart. The hyperdrive's working fine today. Let's hope so, Leia murmured. See, as long as they're chasing us, they can't bother Phil, Han went on, and the farther we draw them away, the longer the backup force will have to get here from Ord Padron. The brilliant green flash of a near miss cut off Leia's intended response. I think we've given them all the time we can, she told Han. Within her, she could sense the turmoil coming from our unborn twins. Can we please get out of here? A second bolt spattered off the Falcon's upper deflector shield. Yeah, I think you're right, Han agreed. Wedge, you ready to leave this party? Whenever you are, Falcon, Wedge said. Go ahead. We'll follow you when you are clear. Right. Reaching over, Han gripped the hyperdrive levers and pulled them gently back. Through the cockpit canopy, the stars stretched themselves into star lines, and they were safe. Leia took a deep breath, let it out slowly. Within her, she could still sense the twins' anxiety, and for a moment she turned her mind to the job of calming them down. It was a strange sensation, she'd often thought, touching minds that dealt in emotion and pure sensation instead of pictures and words, so different from the minds of Han and Luke and her other friends. So different, too, from the distant mind that had been orchestrating that Imperial attack force. Behind her, the door slid open and Chewbacca came into the cockpit. Good shooting, Chewie, Han told the Wookiee as he heaved his massive bulk into the port-side passenger seat beside 3PO. You have any more trouble with the horizontal control arm? Chewbacca rumbled a negative. His dark eyes studying Leia's face, he growled to her question. I'm all right, Leia assured him, blinking back sudden and inexplicable tears. Really? She looked at Han, to find him frowning at her too. You weren't worried, were you? He asked. It was just an Imperial task force. Nothing to get excited about. She shook her head. It wasn't that, Han. There was something else back there. She shook her head again. I don't know. Perhaps it was similar to your indisposition at Endor, 3PO offered helpfully. You remember, when you collapsed while Chewbacca and I were repairing the Chewbacca rumbled a warning, and the droid abruptly shut up, but far too late. No, let him talk, Han said, his sense growing all protectively suspicious as he looked at Leia. What indisposition was this? There wasn't anything to it, Han, Leia assured him, reaching over to take his hand. On our first orbit around Endor, we passed through the spot where the Death Star blew up. For a few seconds, I could feel something like the Emperor's presence around me. That's all. Oh, that's all, Han said sarcastically, throwing a brief glare back at Chewbacca. Our dead Emperor tries to make a grab for you, and you don't think it's worth mentioning. Now you're being silly, Leia chided. There was nothing to worry about. It was over quickly, and there weren't any after effects. Really. Anyway, what I felt back at Phil was completely different. Glad to hear it, Han said, not yet ready to let it go. Did you have any of the med people check you over or anything after you got back? Well, there really wasn't any time before. Fine, you do it as soon as we're back. Leia nodded with a quick sigh. She knew that tone, and it wasn't something she could wholeheartedly argue against anyway. All right, if I can find time. You'll make time, Han countered. Or I'll have Luke lock you in the med center when he gets back. I mean it, sweetheart. Leia squeezed his hand, feeling a similar squeeze on her heart as she did so. Luke, off alone in Imperial territory. But he was all right. He had to be. All right, she told Han. I'll get checked out. I promise. Good, he said, his eyes searching her face. So what was it you felt back at Phil? I don't know, she hesitated. Maybe it was the same thing Luke felt on the Katana. You know, when the Imperials put that landing party of clones aboard. Yeah, Han agreed doubtfully. Maybe. Those dreadnoughts are awfully far away. There are probably a lot more clones though, too. Yeah, maybe, Han said again. Well, I suppose Chewie and me'd better get to work on that ion flux stabilizer before it quits on us completely. Can you handle things up here okay, sweetheart? I'm fine, Leia assured him, just as glad to be leaving this line of conversation. You two go ahead. Because the other possibility was one she'd just as soon not think about right away. The Emperor, it had long been rumoured, had the ability to use the Force to exercise direct control over his military forces. If the Jedi Master Luke had confronted on Jomark had that same ability. Reaching down, she caressed her belly and focused on the pair of tiny minds within her. No, it was indeed not something she wanted to think of about. I presume, Thrawn said in that deadly calm voice of his, that you have some sort of explanation. Slowly, deliberately, Sabaoth lifted his head from the command room's double display circle to look at the Grand Admiral. At the Grand Admiral and, with undisguised contempt, at the Asalamir on its nutrient frame slung across Thrawn's shoulders. Do you likewise have an explanation, Grand Admiral Thrawn? He demanded. You broke off the diversionary attack on Filv, Thrawn said, ignoring Sabaoth's question. You then proceeded to send the entire task force on a dead-end chase. And you, Grand Admiral Thrawn, have failed to bring my Jedi to me, Sabaoth countered. His voice, Plan noticed uneasily, was slowly rising in both pitch and volume. You, your tame Nograi, your entire empire, all of you have failed. Thrawn's glowing red eyes narrowed. Indeed? And was it also our failure that you were unable to hold on to Luke Skywalker after we delivered him to you on Jomark? You did not deliver him to me, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Sabaoth insisted. I summoned him there through the Force. It was Imperial intelligence who planted the rumour that Jorah Sabaoth had returned and been seen on Jomark. Thrawn cut him off coldly. It was Imperial transport who brought you there, Imperial supply who arranged and provisioned that house for you, and Imperial engineering who built the camouflaged island landing site for your use. The Empire did its part to get Skywalker into your hands. It was you who failed to keep him there. No! Sabaoth snapped. Skywalker left Jomark because Mara Jade escaped from you and twisted his mind against me, and she will pay for that. You hear me? She shall pay. For a long moment Thrawn was silent. You threw the entire Filv task force against the Millennium Falcon, he said at last, his voice under control again. Did you succeed in capturing Leia Organa solo? No, Sabaoth growled, but not because she didn't want to come to me. She does, just as Skywalker does. Thrawn threw a glance at Palaeon. She wants to come to you, he asked. Sabaoth smiled. Very much, he said, his voice unexpectedly losing all its anger, becoming almost dreamy. She wants me to teach her children, he continued, his eyes drifting around the command room, to instruct them in the ways of the Jedi, to create them in my own image, because I am the Master, the only one there is. He looked back at Thrawn. You must bring her to me, Grand Admiral Thrawn, he said, his manner somewhere halfway between solemn and pleading. We must free her from her entrapment among those who fear her powers. They'll destroy her if we don't. Of course we must, Thrawn said soothingly, but you must leave that task to me. All I need is a little more time. Sabaoth frowned a thought, his hand slipping up beneath his beard to finger the medallion hanging on its neck chain, and Palaeon felt a shiver run up his back. No matter how many times he saw it happen, he would never get used to these sudden dips into the slippery twilight of clone madness. It had, he knew, been a universal problem with the early cloning experiments, a permanent mental and emotional instability, inversely scaled to the length of the duplicate's growth cycle. Few of the scientific papers on the subject had survived the Clone Wars era, but Palaon had come across one that had suggested that no clone grown to maturity in less than a year would be stable enough to survive outside of a totally controlled environment. Given the destruction that had unleashed on the galaxy, Palaon had always assumed that the Clone Masters had eventually found at least a partial solution to the problem. Whether they had recognized the underlying cause of the madness was another question entirely. It could very well be that Thrawn was the first to truly understand it. Very well, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Sabaoth said abruptly. You may have one final chance, but I warn you, it will be your last. After that, I will take the matter into my own hands. Beneath the bushy eyebrows, his eyes flashed. And I warn you further, if you cannot accomplish even so small a task, perhaps I will deem you unworthy to lead the military forces of my empire. Thrawn's eyes glittered, but he merely inclined his head slightly. I accept your challenge, Master Sabaoth. Good. Deliberately, Sabaoth resettled himself into his seat and closed his eyes. You may leave me now, Grand Admiral Thrawn. I wish to meditate and to plan for the future of my Jedi. For a moment, Thrawn stood silently, his glowing red eyes gazing unblinkingly at Sabaoth. Then he shifted his gaze to Palaon. You'll accompany me to the bridge, Captain, he said. I want you to oversee the defense arrangements for the Yukio system. Yes, sir, Palaon said, glad of any excuse to get away from Sabaoth. For a moment he paused, feeling a frown across his face as he looked down at Sabaoth. Had there been something he had wanted to bring to Thrawn's attention? He was almost certain there was. Something having to do with Sabaoth and clones and the Mount Tantus project. But the thought wouldn't come, and with a mental shrug he pushed the question aside. It would surely come to him in time. Stepping around the display ring, he followed his commander from the room. It was called the Kalias Saj Lilu, the city of glowing crystal of Burchess, and had been one of the most spectacular wonders of the galaxy since the earliest days of the Old Republic. The entire city was nothing more or less than a single gigantic crystal created over the eons by saltile spray from the dark red-orange waters of the Lefari Sea that roiled up against the low bluff upon which it rested. The original city had been painstakingly sculpted from the crystal over decades by local Burchestian artisans, whose descendants continued to guide and nurture its slow growth. At the height of the Old Republic, Kalias had been a major tourist attraction, its populace making a comfortable living from the millions of beings who flocked to the stunning beauty of the city and its surroundings. But the chaos of the Clone Wars and the subsequent rise of the Empire had taken a severe toll on such idle amusements, and Kalias had been forced to turn to other means for its support. Fortunately, the tourist trade had left a legacy of well-established trade routes between Burchest and most of the galaxy's major systems. The obvious solution was for the Burchestians to promote Kalias as a trade centre, and while the city was hardly to the level yet of Sivran or Kataris, they had achieved a modest degree of success. The only problem was that it was a trade centre on the Imperial side of the line. A squad of stormtroopers strode down the crowded street, their white armour taking on a coloured tinge from the angular red-orange buildings around them. Taking a long step out of their way, Luke Skywalker pulled his hood a bit closer around his face. He could sense no particular alertness from the squad, but this deep into Imperial space there was no reason to take chances. The stormtrooper strode past without so much as a glance in his direction, and with a quiet sigh of relief, Luke returned his attention to his contemplation of the city. Between the stormtroopers, the Imperial fleet crew was on layover between flights, and the smugglers poking around hoping to pick up jobs. The darkly business-like sense of the city was in strange and pointed contrast to its serene beauty. And somewhere in all that serene beauty was something far more dangerous than mere Imperial stormtroopers. A group of clones. Also New Republic intelligence fought, painstakingly sifting through thousands of intercepted Imperial communiques, that tentatively pinpointed Kalias and the Burchest system as one of the transfer points in the new flood of human duplicates beginning to man the ships and troop carriers of Grand Admiral Thrawn's war machine. That flood had to be stopped, and quickly, which meant finding the location of the cloning tanks and destroying them, which first meant backtracking the traffic pattern from a known transfer point, which first meant confirming that clones were indeed coming through Kalias. A group of men dressed in the dull bands and robes of Sivrani traders came around a corner 2 blocks ahead, and as he had so many times in the past 2 days, Luke reached out toward them with the Force. One quick check was all it took. The traders did not have the strange aura he'd detected in the boarding party of clones that had attacked them aboard the Katana. But even as he withdrew his consciousness, something else caught Luke's attention, something he had almost missed amid the torrent of human and alien thoughts and sensations that swirled together around him like bits of coloured glass in a sandstorm. A coolly calculating mind, one which Luke felt certain he'd encountered before but couldn't quite identify through the haze of mental noise between them. and the owner of that mind was, in turn, fully aware of Luke's presence in Callias, and was watching him. Luke grimaced, alone in enemy territory, with his transport 2 kilometers away at the Callias landing field and his only weapon a lightsaber that would identify him the minute he drew it from his tunic. He was not exactly holding the high ground here, but he had the Force, and he knew his follower was there. All in all, it gave him fair odds. A couple of meters to his left was the entrance to the long arched tunnel of a pedestrian bridgeway. Turning down it, Luke stepped up his pace, trying to remember from his study of the city maps exactly where this particular bridge went. Across the city's icy river, he decided, and up toward the taller and higher class regions overlooking the sea itself. Behind him, he sensed his pursuer follow him into the bridgeway, and as Luke put distance between himself and the mental din of the crowded market regions behind him, he was finally able to identify the man. It was not as bad as he'd feared, but potentially at least it was bad enough. With a sigh, Luke stopped and waited. The bridgeway, with its gentle curve hiding both ends from view, was as good a place as any for a confrontation. His pursuer came to the last part of the curve. Then, as if anticipating that his quarry would be waiting there, he stepped just out of sight. Luke extended his senses, caught the sound of a blaster being drawn. "It's all right," he called softly. "We're alone. Come on out." There was a brief hesitation, and Luke caught the momentary flicker of surprise, and then Talon Card stepped into sight. "I see the universe hasn't run out of ways to surprise me," the smuggler commented, inclining his head to Luke in an abbreviated bow as he slid his blaster back into its holster. "From the way you were acting, I thought you were probably a spy from the New Republic, but I have to admit you're the last person I would have expected them to send." Luke eyed him, trying hard to read the sense of the man. The last time he'd seen Card, just after the battle for the katana, the other had emphasized that he and his smuggling group intended to remain neutral in this war. "What were you going to do after you knew for sure? I hadn't planned on turning you in, if that's what you mean," Card said, throwing a glance behind him down the bridgeway. "If it's all the same to you, I'd like to move on, but Chestians don't normally hold extended conversations in bridgeways, and the tunnel can carry voices a surprising distance. And if there were an ambush waiting for them at the other end of the bridgeway? But if there were, Luke would know before they reached it." "Fine with me," he said, stepping to the side and gesturing Card forward. The other favoured him with a sardonic smile. "You don't trust me, do you?" he said, brushing past Luke and heading down the bridgeway. "Must be Han's influence," Luke said apologetically, falling into step beside him. "His or yours? Or maybe Mara's." He caught the shift in Card's sense, a quick flush of concern that was as quickly buried again. "Speaking of Mara, how is she?" "Nearly recovered," Luke assured him. "The medics tell me that repairing that kind of light neural damage isn't difficult, just time-consuming." Card nodded, his eyes on the tunnel ahead. "I appreciate you taking care of her," he said, almost grudgingly. "Our own medical facilities wouldn't have been up to the task." Luke waved a thanks away. "It was the least we could do after the help you gave us at the katana." "Perhaps." They reached the end of the bridgeway and stepped out into a street considerably less crowded than the one they'd left. Above and ahead of them, the 3 intricately carved government headquarter towers that faced the sea could be seen above the nearby buildings. Reaching out with the Force, Luke did a quick reading of the people passing by. Nothing. "You heading anywhere in particular?" he asked Card. The other shook his head. "Wandering the city," he said casually. "You?" "The same," Luke said, trying to match the other's tone, and hoping to see a familiar face or two. "Or 3, or 4, or 5? So Card knew, or had guessed, why he was here. Somehow that didn't really surprise him. "If they're here to be seen, I'll find them," he said. "I don't suppose you have any information I could use?" "I might," Card said. "Do you have enough money to pay for it?" "Knowing your prices, probably not," Luke said. "But I could set you up a credit line when I get back." "If you get back," Card countered. "Considering how many Imperial troops there are between you and safe territory, you're not what I would call a good investment risk at the moment." Luke cocked an eyebrow at him. "As opposed to a smuggler at the top of the Empire's locate and detain list?" he asked pointedly. Card smiled. "As it happens, Calais is one of the few places in Imperial space where I'm perfectly safe. The Burchestian governor and I have known each other for several years. More to the point, there are certain items important to him which only I can supply." "Military items? I'm not part of your war, Skywalker," Card reminded him coolly. "I'm neutral and I intend to stay that way. I thought I'd made that clear to you and your sister when we last parted company." "Oh, it was clear enough," Luke agreed. "I just thought that events of the past month might have changed your mind." Card's expression didn't change, but Luke could detect the almost unwilling shift in his sense. "I don't particularly like the idea of Grand Admiral Thrawn having access to a cloning facility," he conceded. "It has the long-term potential for shifting the balance of power in his favour. That's something neither of us wants to see happen. But I think your side is rather overreacting to the situation." "I don't know how you can call it overreacting," Luke said. "The Empire has most of the 200 dreadnoughts of the Katana fleet. Now they've got an unlimited supply of clones to crew them with." Unlimited is hardly the word I would use, Card said. Clones can only be grown so quickly if you want them mentally stable enough to trust your warships. 1 year minimum per clone, as I recall the old rule of thumb. A group of 5 Vafkree passed by in front of them along a cross street. So far the Empire had been only cloning humans, but Luke checked them out anyway. Again, nothing. A year per clone, you say? At the absolute minimum, Card said. The pre-Clone Wars documents I've seen suggest 3 to 5 years would be a more appropriate period. Quicker than the standard human growth cycle, certainly, but hardly any reason for panic. Luke looked up at the carved towers, their sunlit red-orange in sharp contrast to the billowing white clouds rolling in from the sea behind them. What would you say if I told you the clones who attacked us on the Katana were grown in less than a year? Card shrugged. That depends on how much less. The full cycle was 15 to 20 days. Card stopped short. What? He demanded, turning to stare at Luke. 15 to 20 days, Luke repeated, stopping beside him. For a long moment, Card locked eyes on with him. Then slowly he turned away and began walking again. That's impossible, he said. There must be an error. I can get you a copy of the studies. Card nodded thoughtfully, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. At least that explains Yukio. Yukio? Luke frowned. Card glanced at him. That's right. You've probably been out of touch for a while. 2 days ago, the Imperials launched a multiple attack on targets in the Abrion and Dufilvian systems. They severely damaged a military base at Ord Padron and captured the Yukio system. Luke felt a hollow sensation in his stomach. Yukio was one of the top 5 producers of foodstuffs in the entire New Republic. The repercussions for Abrion's sector alone. How badly was Yukio damaged? Apparently not at all, Card said. My sources tell me it was taken with its shields and ground/space weaponry intact. The hollow feeling got a little bigger. I thought that was impossible to do. A knack for doing the impossible was one of the things Grand Admirals were selected for, Card said dryly. Details of the attack are still sketchy. It'll be interesting to see how he pulled it off. So Thrawn had the Katana dreadnoughts, and he had clones to man them with, and now he had the ability to provide food for those clones. This isn't just a setup to another series of raids, Luke said slowly. The Empire's getting ready to launch a major offensive. It does begin to look that way, Card agreed. Offhand, I'd say you have your work cut out for you. Luke studied him. Card's voice and face were as calm as ever, but the sense behind them wasn't nearly so certain anymore. And none of this changes your mind? He prompted the other. I'm not joining the New Republic, Skywalker, Card said, shaking his head. For many reasons, not the least being that I don't entirely trust certain elements in your government. I think failure has been pretty well discredited. I wasn't referring only to failure. Card cut him off. You know as well as I do how fond the Mon Calamari have always been of smugglers. Now that Admiral Akbar's been reinstated to his council and supreme commander positions, all of us in the trade are going to have to start watching over our shoulders again. Oh, come on, Luke snorted. You don't think Akbar's going to have time to worry about smugglers, do you? Card smiled wryly. Not really, but I'm not willing to risk my life on it either. Stalemate. All right then, Luke said. Let's put it on a strictly business level. We need to know the Empire's movements and intentions, which is something you probably keep track of anyway. Can we buy that information from you? Card considered. That might be possible, he said cautiously, but only if I have the final say on what I pass on to you. I won't have you turning my group into an unofficial arm of New Republic intelligence. Agreed, Luke said. It was less than he might have hoped for, but it was better than nothing. I'll set up a credit line for you as soon as I get back. Perhaps we should start with a straight information trade, Card said, looking around at the crystalline buildings. Tell me what started your people looking at Kaelius. I'll do better than that, Luke said. The distant touch on his mind was faint but unmistakable. How about if I confirm the clones are here? Where? Card asked sharply. Somewhere that way, Luke said, pointing ahead and slightly to the right. Half a kilometre away, maybe. It's hard to tell. Inside one of the towers, Card decided. Nice and secure and well hidden from prying eyes. I wonder if there's any way to get inside for a look. Wait a minute. They're moving, Luke said, frowning as he tried to hang on to the contact. Heading almost toward us, but not quite. Probably being taken to the landing field, Card said. He glanced around and pointed to their right. They'll probably use Maverill Street, 2 blocks that direction. Balancing speed with the need to remain inconspicuous, they covered the distance in 3 minutes. They'll probably use a cargo carrier or light transport, Card said as they found a spot where they could watch the street without being run over by the pedestrian traffic along the edges of the vehicle way. Anything obviously military would attract attention. Luke nodded. Maverill, he remembered from the maps, was one of the handful of streets in Kaelius that had been carved large enough for vehicles to use, with the result that the traffic was running pretty much fore to aft. I wish I had some macro binoculars with me, he commented. Trust me, you're conspicuous enough as it is. Card counted as he craned his neck over the passing crowds. Any sign of them? They're definitely coming this way, Luke told him. He reached out with the force, trying to sort out the clone's sense from the sandstorm of other forts and mines surrounding him. I'd guess 20 to 30 of them.
A cargo carrier, then, Card decided. There's one coming now, just behind that Trast speeder truck. I see it. Luke took a deep breath, calling on every bit of his Jedi skill. That's them, he murmured, a shiver running up his back. All right, Card said, his voice grim. Watch closely. They might have left one or more of the ventilation panels open. The cargo carrier made its way toward them on its repulsor lifts, coming abruptly to a halt a short block away as the driver of the speeder truck in front of it suddenly woke up to the fact that he'd reached his turn. Gingerly, the truck eased around the corner, blocking the whole traffic flow behind it. Wait here, Card said, and dived into the stream of pedestrians heading that direction. Luke kept his eyes sweeping the area, alert for any sense that he or Card had been seen and recognized. If this whole setup was some kind of elaborate trap for off-world spies, now would be the obvious time to spring it. The truck finally finished its turn, and the cargo carrier lumbered on, past Luke and continued down the street, disappearing within a few seconds around one of the red-orange buildings. Stepping back into the side street behind him, Luke waited, and a minute later Card had returned. Two of the vents are open, but I couldn't see enough to be sure, he told Luke, breathing heavily. You? Luke shook his head. I couldn't see anything either, but it was them. I'm sure of it. For a moment Card studied his face. Then he gave a curt nod. All right. What now? I'm going to see if I can get my ship off planet ahead of them, Luke said. If I can track their hyperspace vector, maybe we can figure out where they go from here. He lifted his eyebrows. Though two ships working together could do a better track. Card smiled slightly. You'll forgive me if I decline the offer, he said. Flying in tandem with a New Republic agent is not exactly what I would call maintaining neutrality. He glanced over Luke's shoulder at the street behind him. At any rate, I think I'd prefer to try backtracking them from here, see if I can identify their point of origin. Sounds good, Luke nodded. I'd better get over to the landing field and get my ship prepped. I'll be in touch, Card promised. Make sure that credit line is a generous one. Standing at the uppermost window of Central Government Tower Number 1, Governor Staffer lowered his macro binoculars with a satisfied snort. That was him all right, Fingal, he said to the little man hovering at his side. No doubt about it. Luke Skywalker himself. Do you suppose he saw the special transport? Fingal asked, fingering his own macro binoculars nervously. Well, of course he saw it, Staffer growled. You think he was hanging around Maverill Street for his health? Only thought, don't think, Fingal, Staffer cut him off. You aren't properly equipped for it. He sauntered to his desk, dropped the macro binoculars into a drawer, and pulled up Grand Admiral Thrawn's directive on his datapad. It was a rather bizarre directive, in his private and strictly confidential opinion, more peculiar even than these mysterious troop transfers the Imperial High Command had been running through Callius of late. But one had no choice under the circumstances but to assume Thrawn knew what he was doing. At any rate, it was on his own head, not Staffer's, if he didn't, and that was the important thing. I want you to send a message to the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, he told Fingal, lowering his bulk carefully into his chair and pushing the datapad across the desk. Coded as per the instructions here. Inform Grand Admiral Thrawn that Skywalker has been on Callius and that I have personally observed him near the special transport. Also, as per the Grand Admiral's directive, he has been allowed to leave Burchest unhindered. Yes, Governor, Fingal said, making notes on his own datapad. If the little man saw anything unusual about letting a rebel spy walk freely through Imperial territory, he wasn't showing it. What about the other man, Governor? The one who was with Skywalker down there? Stafford pursed his lips. The price on Talon Card's head was up to nearly 50,000 now, a great deal of money even for a man of a planetary governor's salary and perks. He'd always known that someday it would be in his best interest to terminate the quiet business relationship he had with Card. Perhaps that time had finally come. No, not while war still raged through the galaxy. Later, perhaps, when victory was near and private supply lines could be made more reliable, but not now. The other man is of no importance, he told Fingal. A special agent I sent to help smoke the rebel spy into the open. Forget him. Go on, get that message coded and sent. Yes, sir, Fingal nodded, stepping toward the door. The panel slid open, and just for a second, as Fingal stepped through, Staffer thought he saw an odd glint in the little man's eye. Some strange trick of the outer office light, of course. Next to his unbending loyalty for his governor, Fingal's most prominent and endearing attribute was his equally unbending lack of imagination. Taking a deep breath, putting Fingal and rebel spies and even Grand Admirals out of his mind, Staffer leaned back in his chair and began to consider how he would use the shipment that Card's people were even now unloading at the landing field. Slowly, as if climbing a long dark staircase, Mara Jade pulled herself out of a deep sleep. She opened her eyes, looked around the softly lit room, and wondered where in the galaxy she was. It was a medical area. That much was obvious from the biomonitors, the folded room dividers, and the other multi-position beds scattered around the one she was lying in, but it wasn't one of Card's facilities, at least not one she was familiar with. But the layout itself was all too familiar. It was a standard Imperial recovery room. For the moment she seemed to be alone, but she knew that wouldn't last. Silently she rolled out of bed into a crouching position on the floor, taking a quick inventory of her physical condition as she did so. No aches or pains, no dizziness or obvious injuries. Slipping into the robe and bed shoes at the end of the bed, she padded silently to the door, preparing herself mentally to silence or disable whatever was out there. She waved at the door release. As the panel slid open, she leaped through into the recovery anteroom and came to a sudden, slightly disoriented halt. "Oh, hi, Mara," Gent said distractedly, glancing up from the computer terminal he was hunched over before returning his attention to it. "How are you feeling?" "Not too bad," Mara said, staring at the kid and sifting furiously through a set of hazy memories. Gent, one of Card's employees and possibly the best slicer in the galaxy, and the fact that he was sitting at a terminal meant they weren't prisoners, unless their captor was so abysmally stupid that he didn't know better than to let a slicer get within spitting distance of a computer. But hadn't Gent to the New Republic headquarters on Coruscant? Yes, she had. On Card's instructions, just before collecting some of his group together and leading them into that melee at the Katana fleet, where she'd run her Z-95 up against the Imperial Star Destroyer and had to eject, and had brilliantly arranged to fly her ejector seat straight through an ion cannon beam, which had fried her survival equipment and sent her drifting, lost forever, in interstellar space. She looked around her. Apparently forever hadn't lasted as long as she'd expected it to. "Where are we?" she asked, though she had a pretty good idea now what the answer would be. She was right. "The old Imperial Palace on Coruscant," Gent told her, frowning a little. "Medical wing. They had to do some reconstruction on your neural pathways. Don't you remember?" "It's a little vague," Mara admitted. But as the last cobwebs cleared from her brain, the rest of it was beginning to fall into place. Her ejector seat's ruined life support system, and a strange light-headed vagueness as she drifted off to sleep in the darkness. She'd probably suffered oxygen deprivation before they'd been able to locate her and get her to his ship. No, not they. Him. There was only one person who could possibly have found a single crippled ejector seat and all the emptiness and battle debris out there. Luke Skywalker, the last of the Jedi Knights. The man she was going to kill. "You will kill Luke Skywalker." She took a step back to lean against the door jamb, knees suddenly feeling weak as the Emperor's words echoed through her mind. She'd been here, on this world and in this building, when he died over Endor. Had watched through his mind as Luke Skywalker cut him down, brought her life crushing in ruins around her head. "I see you're awake," a new voice said. Mara opened her eyes. The newcomer, a middle-aged woman in a duty medic's tunic, was marching briskly across the room toward her from a far door, an MD droid trailing in her wake. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," Mara said, feeling a sudden urge to lash out at the other woman. These people, these enemies of the Empire, had no right to be here in the Emperor's palace. She took a careful breath, fighting back the flash of emotion. The medic had stopped short, a professional frown on her face. Gent, his cherished computers momentarily forgotten, had a puzzled look on his. "Sorry," she muttered. "I guess I'm still a little disoriented." "Understandable," the medic nodded. "You've been lying in that bed for a month, after all." Mara stared at her. "A month?" "Well, most of a month," the medic corrected herself. "You also spent some time in a Bacta tank. Don't worry, short-term memory problems are common during neural reconstructions, but they nearly always clear up after the treatment." "I understand," Mara said mechanically. "A month. She'd lost a whole month here. And in that time, we have a guest suite arranged for you upstairs whenever you feel ready to leave here," the medic continued. "Would you like me to see if it's ready?" Mara focused on her. "That would be fine," she said. The medic pulled out a comlink and thumbed it on. As she began talking, Mara stepped past her to Gent's side. "What's been happening with the war during the last month?" she asked him. "Oh, the Empire's been making the usual trouble," Gent said, waving toward the sky. "They've got the folks here pretty stirred up anyway. Akbar and Maydeen and the rest have been running around like crazy, trying to push him back and cut him off, something like that." That was, Mara knew, but all she would get out of him on the subject of current events. Aside from the fascination of smuggler folklore, the only thing that really mattered to Gent was slicing at computers. She frowned, belatedly remembering why Card had ordered Gent here in the first place. "Wait a minute," she said. "Akbar's back in command? You mean you've cleared him already?" "Sure," Gent said. "That suspicious bank deposit thing Councillor Failure made such a fuss over was a complete fraud. The guys who did that electronic break-in at the blank planted it in his account at the same time. Probably Imperial intelligence. It had their noseprints all over the programming. Oh, sure. I proved that 2 days after I got here. I imagine they were pleased. So why are you still here?" "Well..." For a moment Gent seemed taken aback. "No one's come back to get me, for one thing." His face brightened. "Besides, there's this really neat encrypt code someone nearby is using to send information to the Empire. General Belibla says the Imperials call it Delta Source and that it's sending them stuff right out of the palace." And he asked you to slice it for them? Mara nodded, feeling her lip twist. I don't suppose he offered to pay you or anything? Well, Ghent shrugged. Probably they did. I don't remember really. The medic replaced her comlink in her belt. Your guide will be here momentarily, she told Mara. Thank you, Mara said, resisting the urge to tell the other that she probably knew the Imperial Palace better in her sleep than any guide Bad could do in broad daylight. Cooperation and politeness. Those were the keys to talking them out of her ship and getting her and Ghent out of this place and out of their war. Behind the medic, the door slid open, and a tall woman with pure white hair glided into the room. Hello, Mara, she said, smiling gravely. My name is Winter, personal aide to Princess Leia Organa Solo. I'm glad to see you on your feet again. I'm glad to be there, Mara said, trying to keep her voice polite. Someone else associated with Skywalker. Just what she needed. I take it you're my guide. Your guide, your assistant, and anything else you need for the next few days, Winter said. Princess Leia asked me to look after you until she and Captain Solo returned from Filv. I don't need an assistant, and I don't need looking after, Mara said. All I really need is a ship. I've already started working on that, Winter said. I'm hoping we'll be able to find something for you soon. In the meantime, may I show you to your suite? Mara hid a grimace. The usurpers of the New Republic, graciously offering her hospitality in what had once been her own home. That's very kind of you, she said, trying not to sound sarcastic. You coming, Ghent? You go on ahead, Ghent said absently, gazing at the computer display. I want to sit on this run for a while. He'll be all right here, Winter assured her. This way, please. They left the anteroom, and Winter led the way toward the rear of the palace. Ghent has a suite right next to yours, Winter commented as they walked, but I don't think he's been there more than twice in the past month. He set up temporary shop out there in the recovery anteroom where he could keep an eye on you. Mara had to smile at that. Ghent, who spent roughly 90% of his waking hours oblivious to the outside world, was not exactly what she would go looking for in either a nurse or a bodyguard, but it was the thought that counted. I appreciate you people taking care of me, she told Winter. It's the least we could do to thank you for coming to our assistance at the katana battle. It was Card's idea, Mara said shortly. Thank him, not me. We did, Winter said, but you risked your life too on our behalf. We won't forget that. Mara threw a sideways look at the white-haired woman. She had read the Emperor's files on the rebellion's leaders, including Leia Organa, and the name Winter wasn't ringing any bells at all. How long have you been with Organa Solo? She asked. I grew up with her in the royal court of Alderaan, Winter said, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. We were friends in childhood. When she began her first steps into galactic politics, her father assigned me to be her aide. I've been with her ever since. I don't recall hearing about you during the height of the rebellion, Mara probed gently. I spent most of the war moving from planet to planet, working with supply and procurement, Winter told her. If my colleagues could get me into a warehouse or depot on some pretext, I could draw a map for them of where the items were that they wanted. It made the subsequent raids quicker and safer. Mara nodded as understanding came. So you were the one called Targeter, the one with the perfect memory. Winter's forehead creased slightly. Yes, that was one of my code names, she said. I had many others over the years. I see, Mara said. She could remember a fair number of references in pre-Yavin intelligence reports to the mysterious rebel named Targeter, much of the politely heated discussion centering around his or her possible identity. She wondered if the data pushes had ever even gotten close. They'd reached a set of turbo lifts at the rear of the Imperial Palace now, one of the major renovations the Emperor had made in the deliberately antiquated design of the building when he'd taken it over. The turbo lift saved a lot of walking up and down the sweeping staircases in the more public parts of the building, as well as masking certain other improvements the Emperor had made in the palace. So what's the problem with getting me a ship? Mara asked as Winter tapped the call plate. The problem is the Empire, Winter said. They've launched a massive attack against us and it's tied up basically everything we have available from Light Frieda on up. Mara frowned. Massive attacks against superior forces didn't sound like Grand Admiral Thrawn at all. It's that bad? It's bad enough, Winter said. I don't know if you know it, but they beat us to the Katana fleet. They'd already moved nearly 180 of the dreadnoughts by the time we arrived. Combined with their new bottomless source of crews and soldiers, the balance of power has been badly shifted. Mara nodded, a sour taste in her mouth. Put that way, it did sound like Thrawn, which means I nearly got myself killed for nothing. Winter smiled tightly. If it helps, so did a lot of other people. The turbolift car arrived. They stepped inside, and Winter keyed for the palace's residential areas. Ghent mentioned that the Empire was making trouble, Mara commented as the car began moving upward. I should have realized that anything that could penetrate that fog he walks around in had to be serious. Serious is an understatement, Winter said grimly. In the past 5 days, we've effectively lost control of 4 sectors, and 13 more are on the edge. The biggest loss was the food production facilities at Yukio. Somehow they managed to take it with its defenses intact. Mara felt her lip twist. Someone asleep at the board? Not according to the preliminary reports, Winter hesitated. There are rumors that the Imperials used a new superweapon that was able to fire straight through the Yukian's planetary shield. We're still trying to check that out. Mara swallowed, visions of the old Death Star spec sheets floating up from her memory. A weapon like that in the hands of a strategist like Grand Admiral Thrawn. She shook the thought away. This wasn't her war. Card had promised they would stay neutral in this thing. I suppose I'd better get in touch with Card then, she said. See if he can send someone to pick us up. It would probably be faster than waiting for one of our ships to be free, Winter agreed. He left a data card with the name of a contact you can send a message through. He said you'd know which encrypt code to use. The turbo lift let them out at the President's guest's floor, one of the few sections of the palace that the Emperor had left strictly alone during his reign. With its old-fashioned hinge doors and hard-carved exotic wood furnishings, walking around the floor was like stepping 1,000 years into the past. The Emperor had generally reserved the suites here for those emissaries who had fond feelings for such bygone days, and for those who could be impressed by his carefully manufactured continuity with that era. Captain Card left some of your clothes and personal effects for you after the katana battle, Winter said, unlocking one of the carved doors and pushing it open. If you missed anything, let me know and I can probably supply it. Here's the data card I mentioned, she added, pulling it from her tunic. Thank you, Mara said. Inhaling deeply, she took that card. This particular suite was done largely in Fijisi wood from Carduine, and as the delicate scent rose around her, her thoughts flashed back to the glittering days of grand imperial power and majesty. Can I get you anything else? The memory faded. Winter was standing before her, and the glory days of the Empire were gone. No, I'm fine, she said. Winter nodded. If you want anything, just call the duty officer, she said, gesturing to the desk. I'll be available later. Right now, there's a council meeting I need to sit in on. Go ahead, Mara said. And thank you. Winter smiled and left. Mara took another deep breath of Fijisi wood, and with an effort pushed the last of the lingering memories away. She was here, and it was now, and as the Emperor's instructors had so often drummed into her, the first item of business was to fit into her surroundings, and that meant not looking like an escapee from the medical wing. Carter left a good assortment of clothing for her, a semi-formal gown, 2 outfits of a nondescript type that she could wear on the streets of 100 worlds without looking out of place, and 4 of the no-nonsense tunic/jumpsuit outfits that she usually wore aboard ship. Choosing one of the latter, she got dressed, then began sorting through the other things Carter had left. With any luck, and maybe a little foresight on Card's part. There it was, the forearm holster for a tiny blaster. The blaster itself was missing, of course. The captain of the Adamant had taken it away from her, and the Imperials weren't likely to return it anytime soon. Looking for a duplicate in the New Republic's arsenals would probably be a waste of effort as well, though she was tempted to ask Winter for one just to see the reaction. Fortunately, there was another way. Each residential floor of the Imperial Palace had an extensive library, and in each of those libraries was a multicard set entitled The Complete History of Corvus Minor. Given how unexceptional most of Corvus Minor's history had been, the odds of anyone actually pulling the set off the shelf were extremely slim, which, given there were no actual data cards in the box, was just as well. The blaster was a slightly different style from the one Mara had lost to the Imperials, but its power pack was still adequately charged, and it fit snugly into her forearm holster, and that was all that mattered. Now whatever happened with either the War or New Republic infighting, she would at least have a fighting chance. She paused, the false data card box in her hand, a stray question belatedly flicking through her mind. What had Winter meant by that reference to a bottomless source for crewers and soldiers? Had one or more of the New Republic systems gone over to the Imperial side? Or could Thrawn have discovered a hitherto unknown colony world with a populace ripe for recruitment? It was something that she should probably ask about sometime. First, though, she needed to get a message encrypted and relayed out to Card's designated contact. The sooner she was out of this place, the better. Replacing the empty data card set, the comforting weight of the blaster snugged up against her left arm, she headed back to her suite. Thrawn raised his glowing red eyes from putrid-looking alien artwork displayed on the double display ring surrounding his command chair. No, he said, completely out of the question. Slowly, deliberately, Sabaoth turned back from the holographic whoosh-droid statue he'd been gazing at. No, he repeated, his voice rumbling like an approaching thunderstorm. What do you mean, no? The word is self-explanatory, Thrawn said icily. The military logic should be, as well. We don't have the numbers for a frontal assault on Coruscant, neither have we the supply lines and bases necessary for a traditional siege. Any attack would be both useless and wasteful, and the Empire will therefore not launch one. Sabaoth's face darkened. Have a care, Grand Admiral Thrawn, he warned. I rule the Empire, not you. Do you really? Thrawn countered, reaching up behind him to stroke the Asalamir arched over his shoulder on its Nutrien frame. Sabaoth drew himself up to his full height, eyes blazing with sudden fire. I rule the Empire, he shouted, his voice echoing through the command room. You will obey me, or you will die. Carefully, Palaon eased a little deeper into the force-empty bubble that surrounded Thrawn's Isalamir. At those times when he was in control of himself, C'baoth appeared more confident and in control than he ever had before, but at the same time these violent bursts of clone madness were becoming more frequent and more vicious, like a system in a positive feedback loop, swinging farther from its core point with each oscillation until it ripped itself apart. So far, C'baoth hadn't killed anyone or destroyed anything. In Palaon's opinion, it was just a matter of time before that changed. Perhaps the same thought had occurred to Thrawn. "If you kill me, you'll lose the war," he reminded the Jedi Master, "and if you lose the war, Leia Organa Solo and her twins will never be yours." C'baoth took a step toward Thrawn's command seat, eyes blazing even hotter, and then, abruptly, he seemed to shrink again to normal size. "You would never speak that way to the Emperor," he said, almost petulantly. "On the contrary," Thrawn told him, "on no fewer than 4 occasions I told the Emperor that I would not waste his troops and ships attacking an enemy which I was not yet prepared to defeat." C'baoth snorted. "Only fools spoke that way to the Emperor," he sneered. "Fools, or those tired of life." "The Emperor also thought that way," Thrawn agreed. "The first time I refused, he called me a traitor and gave my attack force to someone else." The Grand Admiral reached up again to stroke his Isalamir. "After his destruction, he knew better than to ignore my recommendations." For a long minute, C'baoth studied Thrawn's face, his own expression twitching back and forth as if the mind behind it was having trouble maintaining a grip on thought or emotion. "You could repeat the Yukian fraud," he suggested at last. "That trick with cloaked cruisers and timed turbo-laser blasts. I would help you." "That's most generous of you," Thrawn said. "Unfortunately, that too would be a waste of effort. The rebel leaders on Coruscant wouldn't be as quick to surrender as Yukio's farm folk were. No matter how accurate our timing, they'd eventually realize that the turbo-laser blasts hitting the surface weren't the same as those fired by the Chimera, and come to the proper conclusion." He gestured to the holographic statues filling the room. "The people and leaders of Wustri, on the other hand, are a different matter entirely. Like the Yukians, they have a strong fear of the unknown and what they perceive to be the impossible. Equally important, they have a tendency to magnify rumors of menace far out of proportion. The cloaked cruiser stratagem should work quite well there." C'baoth's face was starting to redden again. "Grand Admiral Thrawn, but as to Organa Solo and her twins," Thrawn cut him off smoothly, "you can have them whenever you wish." The embryonic tantrum evaporated. "What do you mean?" C'baoth demanded warily. "I mean that attacking Coruscant and carrying off Organa Solo by brute force is impractical," Thrawn said. "Sending in a small group to kidnap her, on the other hand, is perfectly feasible. I've already ordered intelligence to assemble a commando team for that purpose. It should be ready within the day." "A commando team," C'baoth's lip twisted. "Need I remind you how your Nograi have continually failed you in this matter?" "I agree," Thrawn said, an oddly grim note to his voice, "which is why the Nograi will not be involved." Palaon looked down at the Grand Admiral in surprise, then threw an involuntary glance at the door to the commandery anteroom where Thrawn's bodyguard Rook was waiting. Ever since the Lord Darth Vader had first duped the Nograi into their perpetual service to the Empire, the gullible grey-skinned aliens had insisted upon putting their own personal honor on the line with each mission. Being pulled off an assignment, especially one this important, would be like a slap in the face to them, or worse. "Admiral?" he murmured. "I'm not sure. We'll discuss it later, Captain," Thrawn said. "For now, all I need to know is whether Master C'baoth is truly ready to receive his young Jedi." One blue-black eyebrow lifted, or whether he prefers simply discussing it. C'baoth smiled thinly. "Am I to take that as a challenge, Grand Admiral Thrawn? Take it any way you like," Thrawn said. "I merely point out that a wise tactician considers the cost of an operation before launching it. Organa Solo's twins are due to be born any day now, which means you would have 2 infants as well as Organa Solo herself to deal with. If you're not certain you can handle that, it would be best to postpone the operation." Play braced himself for another explosion of clone madness, but to his surprise, it didn't come. "The only question, Grand Admiral Thrawn," C'baoth said softly, "is whether newborn infants will be too much for your Imperial commandos to handle." "Very well," Thrawn nodded. "Our rendezvous with the rest of the fleet will be in 30 minutes. You'll transfer to the Death's Head at that time to assist in their attack on Wustri. By the time you return to the Chimera," again the eyebrow lifted, "we should have your Jedi for you." "Very well, Grand Admiral Thrawn," C'baoth said. He drew himself up again, smoothing his long white beard away from his robe. "But I warn you, if you fail me this time, you will not be pleased with the consequences." Turning, he strode across the command room and through the door. "It's always such a pleasure," Thrawn commented under his breath as the door slid shut. Plan worked moisture into his mouth. "Admiral, with all due respect, you're worried about my having promised to get Organa Solo out of possibly the most secure place in rebellion-held territory?" Thrawn said. "Actually, sir, yes," Palaon said. "The Imperial Palace is supposed to be an impregnable fortress." "Yes, indeed," Thrawn agreed. "But it was the Emperor who made it that way. And as in most things, the Emperor kept a few small secrets about the palace to himself, and to certain of his favourites. Palaon frowned down at him. Secrets? Such as a private way in and out? He hazarded. Thrawn smiled up at him. Precisely. And now that we can finally ensure that Organa Solo will be staying put in the palace for a while, it becomes profitable to try sending in a commando team. But not an Ograi team. Thrawn lowered his eyes to the collection of holographic sculptures surrounding them. There's something wrong with the Nograi, Captain, he said quietly. I don't yet know what it is, but I know it's there. I can sense it with every communication I have with the dynasts on Honogare. Leon thought back to that awkward scene a month ago when that painfully apologetic envoy from the Nograi dynasts had come aboard with the news that the suspected traitor Karbarak had escaped from their custody. So far, despite their best efforts, they'd been unable to recapture him. Perhaps they're still fidgeting over that Karbarak thing, he suggested. And well, they should be, Thrawn said coldly, but it's more than that. And until I find out how much more, the Nograi will remain under suspicion. He leaned forward, tapped two controls on his board. The holographic sculptures faded and were replaced by a tactical map of the current position of the major battle planes. But at the moment, we have two more pressing matters to consider, he continued, leaning back in his seat again. First, we have to divert our increasingly arrogant Jedi Master from this mistaken notion that he has the right to rule my empire. Organa Solo and her twins are that diversion. Plan forward about all the other attempts to capture Organa Solo. And if the team fails, there are contingencies, Thrawn assured him. Despite his power and even his unpredictability, Master Z'Baoth can still be manipulated. He gestured toward the tactical map. What's even more important right now, though, is that we ensure the momentum of our battle plan. So far, the campaign is more reasonably on schedule. The rebellion has resisted more firmly than anticipated in the Farfin and Dolomar sectors, but elsewhere the target systems have generally bowed to Imperial power. I wouldn't consider any of the gains all that solid yet, Playon pointed out. Precisely, Thrawn nodded. Each depends on our maintaining a strong and highly visible Imperial presence, and for that it's vital that we maintain our supply of clones. He paused. Playon looked at the tactical map, his mind racing as he searched for the response Thrawn was obviously waiting for him to come up with. The Sparty cloning cylinders, hidden away for decades in the Emperor's private storehouse on Wayland, were about as safe as anything in the galaxy could be. Buried beneath a mountain, protected by an Imperial garrison, and surrounded by hostile locals, its very existence was unknown to anyone except the top Imperial commanders. He froze. Top Imperial commanders, and perhaps... Mara Jade, he said. She's convalescing on Coruscant. Would she have known about the storehouse? That is indeed the question, Thrawn agreed. There's a good chance she doesn't. I knew many of the Emperor's secrets, and it still took me a great deal of effort to find Wayland, but it's not a risk we can afford to take. Playon nodded, suppressing a shiver. He'd been wondering why the Grand Admiral had chosen an intelligence squad for this mission. Unlike standard commando units, intelligence units are trained in such non-military methods as assassination. Will a single team be handling both missions, sir, or will you be sending in two? One team should be adequate, Thrawn said. The two objectives are well enough interlocked to make that reasonable, and neutralizing Jade does not necessarily mean killing her. Playon frowned, but before he could ask what Thrawn had meant by that, the Grand Admiral touched his board, and the tactical holo was replaced by a map of Aura Sector. In the meantime, I think it's time to underline the importance of the Kalia Saj Lilu for our enemies. Do we have a follow-up report yet from Governor Staffer? Yes, sir, Playon said, pulling up on his datapad. Skywalker left at the same time as the decoy shuttle and is presumed to have followed its vector. If so, he reached the Podera system in approximately 30 hours. Excellent, Thrawn said. He'll undoubtedly report into Coruscant before he reaches Poderus. His subsequent disappearance should go a long way toward convincing him that they've found the conduit for our clone traffic. Yes, sir, Playon said, keeping to himself his doubts as to their chances of actually causing Skywalker to disappear. Thrawn presumably knew what he was doing. One other thing, sir. There was a second follow-up to Staffer's original report, one that came in under an intelligence encrypt code. From his aide, Fingal, Thrawn nodded. A man of Governor Staffer's casual loyalties practically begs us to assign him a quiet watchdog. Are there any discrepancies of the Governor's report? Just one, sir. The follow-up gave a complete description of Skywalker's contact, a man Staffer had indicated was one of his own agents. Fingal's description strongly suggests the man was in fact Talon Card. Thrawn exhaled thoughtfully. Indeed. Did Fingal suggest any explanations for Card's presence in Callius? According to him, there are indications that Governor Staffer has had a private trade agreement with Card for several years, Playon said. Fingal reports he was going to have the man picked up for questioning, but was unable to find a way to do so that wouldn't have alerted Skywalker. Yes, Thrawn murmured. Well, what's done is done, and if smuggling was all that was involved, there's no harm. Still, we can't have random smugglers buzzing around our deceptions and perhaps accidentally poking holes in them, and Card has already proved he can be a great deal of trouble. For a moment, Thrawn gazed in silence at the Aura Sector map. Then he looked up at Peleon. But for now we have other matters to deal with. Prepare our course for the Potterus system, Captain. I want the Chimera there within 40 hours. He smiled thinly, and signaled the garrison commander that I expect him to have a proper reception prepared by the time we arrive. Perhaps in 2 or 3 days' time we'll have an unexpected gift to present to our beloved Jedi Master. Yes, sir, Peleon hesitated. Admiral, what happens if we get Organa Solo and her twins for Sabaoth, and he's able to turn them the way he thinks he can? We'd have 4 of them to deal with instead of just 1. 5 if we're able to capture Skywalker at Potterus. There's no need for concern, Thrawn said, shaking his head. Turning either Organa Solo or Skywalker would take Sabaoth a great deal of time and effort. It would be even long before the infants are old enough to be of any danger to us, no matter what he does to them. Long before any of that occurs, Thrawn's eyes glittered, we'll have come to a suitable arrangement with our Jedi Master over the sharing of power in the Empire. Peleon swallowed. Understood, sir, he managed. Good. Then you're dismissed, Captain. Return to the bridge. Yes, sir. Peleon turned and headed across the room, the muscles in his throat feeling tight. Yes, he understood all right. Thrawn would come to an arrangement with Sabaoth, or he would have the Jedi Master killed. If he could. It was not, Peleon decided, a confrontation he would like to place any bets on, or for that matter, be anywhere near when it happened.
Potterus was one of that select group of worlds generally referred to in the listings as marginal, planets that had remained colonized not because of valuable resources or convenient location, but solely because of the stubborn spirit of its colonists. With a disorienting 10-hour rotational cycle, a lowland slough ecology that had effectively confined the colonists to a vast archipelago of tall mesas, and a nearly perpendicular axial tilt that created tremendous winds every spring and autumn, Potterus was not the sort of place wandering travellers generally bothered with. Its people were tough and independent, tolerant to visitors, but with a long history of ignoring the politics of the outside galaxy, all of which made it an ideal transfer point for the Empire's new clone traffic, and an ideal place for that same Empire to set a trap. The man shadowing Luke was short and plain, the sort of person who would fade into the background almost everywhere he went. He was good at his job too, with a skill that implied long experience in Imperial intelligence, but that experience had naturally not extended to trailing Jedi Knights. Luke had sensed his presence almost as soon as the man had begun following him, and had been able to visually pick him out of the crowd a minute later, leaving only the problem of what to do about him. R2? Luke called softly into the comlink he'd surreptitiously wedged into the neckband of his hooded robe. We've got company, probably Imperials. There was a soft, worried trill from the comlink, followed by something that was obviously a question. There's nothing you can do, Luke told him, taking a guess as to the content of the question and wishing 3PO was there to translate. He could generally pick up the gist of what R2 was saying, but in a situation like this, the gist might not be enough. Is there anyone poking around the Frida, or around the landing field in general? R2 chirped a definite negative. Well, they'll be there soon enough, Luke warned him, pausing to look in a shop window. The tail, he noted, moved forward a few more steps before finding an excuse of his own to stop. A professional indeed. Get as much of the pre-flight done as you can without attracting attention. We'll want to get off as soon as I get there. The droid warbled acknowledgement. Reaching to his neck, Luke shot off the comlink and gave the area a quick scan. The first priority was to lose the tail before the Imperials made any more overt moves against him, and to do that he needed some kind of distraction. 50 meters ahead in the crowd was what looked to be his best opportunity, another man striding along the street in a robe of similar cut and colour to Luke's. Cautiously picking up his pace, trying not to give the appearance of hurrying, Luke moved toward him. The other robed figure continued to the T-junction ahead and turned the corner to his right. Luke picked up his pace a bit more, sensing as he did so his shadow of suspicion that he'd been spotted. Resisting the urge to break into a flat-out run, Luke strolled casually around the corner. It was a street like most of the others he'd already seen in the city, wide, rock-paved, reasonably crowded, and lined on both sides with grey stone buildings. Automatically he reached out with the force, scanning the area around him and as far as he could see, and abruptly caught his breath. Directly ahead, still distant but clearly detectable, were small pockets of darkness where his Jedi senses could read absolutely nothing, as if the force that carried the information to him had somehow ceased to exist, or was being blocked. Which meant that this was no ordinary ambush for an ordinary New Republic spy. The Imperials knew he was here and had come to Potterus equipped with Yasala Miri, and unless he did something fast, they were going to take him. He looked again at the buildings around him, squat two-story structures for the most part, with textured facades and decorative roof parapets. Those to his immediate right were built in a single solid row. Directly across the street to his left, the first building after the T-junction had a warped facade, leaving a narrow gap between it and its neighbours. It wasn't much in the way of cover, and the distance itself was going to be a reach, but it was all he had.
Hurrying across the street, half expecting the trap to be sprung before he got there, he slipped into the opening. Bending his knees, letting the force flow into his muscles, he jumped. He almost didn't make it. The parapet directly above him was angled and smooth, and for a second he seemed to hang in midair as his fingers scrabbled for a hold. Then he found a grip and with a surge of effort pulled himself up and over to lie flat along the rooftop. Just in time. Even as he eased one eye over the edge of the parapet, he saw his tail come racing around the corner, all efforts at subtlety abandoned. Shoving aside those in his way, he said something inaudible into the comlink in his hand, and from the cross street a block away, a row of white-armoured stormtroopers stepped into view. Blaster rifles held high against their chests, the dark elongated shapes of Ysalamiri slung on backpack nutrient frames across their shoulders, they cordoned off the end of the street. It was a well-planned, well-executed net, and Luke had maybe 3 minutes to get across the roof and down before they realised her fish had slipped out of it. Easing back from the edge, he turned his head toward the other side of the roof. The roof didn't have another side. Barely 60 centimetres from where he lay, the roof abruptly became a blank wall that angled steeply downward for perhaps 100 metres, extending in both directions as far as Luke could see. Beyond its lower edge, there was nothing but the distant mists in the lowlands beneath the mesa. He'd miscalculated, possibly fatally. Preoccupied with the man shadowing him, he'd completely missed the fact that his path had taken him to the outer edge of the mesa. The slanting wall beside him was one of the massive shield barriers designed to deflect the planet's vicious seasonal winds harmlessly over the city. Luke had escaped the Imperial net, only to discover that there was literally nowhere else for him to go. Great, he muttered under his breath, easing back to the parapet and looking down into the street. More stormtroopers had joined the first squad now and were beginning to sift through the stunned crowd of people caught in the trap. Behind them, 2 squads from the other direction of the T-junction had moved in to seal off the rear of the street. Luke's erstwhile shadow, a blaster now gripped his hand, was pushing his way through the crowd, making for the other robed figure Luke had noticed earlier. The other robed figure. Luke bit at his lip. It would be a rather unfriendly trick to play on a totally innocent bystander, but on the other hand, the Imperials obviously knew who they were looking for, and just as obviously wanted him alive. Putting the man down there in deadly danger he knew would be unacceptable behaviour for a Jedi. Luke could only hope that inconveniencing him wouldn't fall under the same heading. Gritting his teeth, he reached out with the force and plucked the blaster from the Shadow's hand. Spinning it low over the heads of the crowd, he dropped it squarely into the other robed figure's hand. The Shadow shouted to the stormtroopers. What had begun as a call of triumph quickly became a screech of warning. Focusing the force of all the control he could manage, Luke turned the blaster back toward its former owner and fired. Fired safely over the crowd, of course. There was no possible way for him to aim accurately enough to hit the Imperial, even if he'd wanted to, but even a clean miss was enough to jolt the stormtroopers into action. The Imperials who'd been checking faces and IDs abandoned their tasks to push through the crowd toward the man in the robe, while those guarding the ends of the street hurried forward into backup positions. It was, not surprisingly, too much for the man in the robe. Shaking away the blaster that had inexplicably become attached to his hand, he slipped past the frozen onlookers beside him and disappeared into a narrow alleyway. Luke didn't wait to see any more. The minute anyone got a good look at the fleeing man's face, the diversion would be over, and he had to be off this roof and on his way to the landing field before that happened. Sidling to the edge of his narrow ledge, he looked down. It didn't look promising. Built to withstand 200-kilometer winds, it was perfectly smooth, with no protuberances that would get caught in eddy currents. Nor were there any windows, service doors, or other openings visible. That at least shouldn't be a problem. He could cut himself a makeshift doorway with his lightsaber, if it came to that. The real question was how to get out of range of the Imperials' trap before they started hunting him in earnest. He glanced back, and he had to do it fast. From the direction of the official landing area at the far end of the city, the distant specks of airspeeders had begun to appear over the squat city buildings. He couldn't drop back down on the street side without attracting unwelcome attention. He couldn't crawl along the narrow upper edge of the shield barrier, at least not fast enough to get out of sight before the airspeeders got here, which left him only one direction. Down. But not necessarily straight down. He squinted into the sky. Podorus' sun was nearly to the horizon, moving almost visibly through its 10-hour circuit. Right now its light was shining straight into the eyes of the approaching airspeeder pilots, but within 5 minutes it would be completely below the horizon, giving the searchers a clear view again, and leaving behind a dusk where a lightsaber blade would be instantly visible. It was now or never. Pulling his lightsaber from beneath his robe, Luke ignited it, making sure to keep the glowing green blade out of sight of the approaching airspeeders. Using the tip, he carefully made a shallow cut to the right and a few degrees down across the slanting shield barrier. His robe was made of relatively flimsy material, and it took only a second to tear off the left sleeve and wrap it around the fingertips of his left hand. The padded fingers slipped easily into the groove he'd just made, with enough room to slide freely along it. Getting a firm grip, he set the tip of his lightsaber blade into the end of the groove and rolled off the ledge. Supported by his fingertips, the lightsaber held outstretched in his right hand, carving out his path for him as he went. He slid swiftly down, across and down the shield barrier. It was at the same time exhilarating and terrifying. Memories flooded back, the wind whipping past him as he fell through the center core of the cloud city of Bespin, hanging literally by his fingertips barely minutes later beneath the city, lying exhausted on the floor in the second Death Star, sensing through his pain the enraged helplessness of the Emperor as Vader hurled him to his death. Beneath his chest and legs, the smooth surface of the shield barrier slid past, marking his rapid approach to the edge and the empty space beyond. Lifting his head, blinking against the wind slapping into his face, he looked over his shoulder. The lethal edge was visible now, racing upward toward him at what felt like breakneck speed. Closer and closer it came, and then at the last second he changed the angle of his lightsaber. The downward path of his finger guide shifted toward horizontal, and a few seconds later he slid smoothly to a halt. For a moment he just hung there, dangling precariously by one hand as he caught his breath and got his heartbeat back under control. Above him, its edge catching the last rays of the setting sun, he could see the groove he'd just cut, angling up and to his left. Over 100 meters to his left, he estimated, hopefully far enough to put him outside the Imperial's trap. He'd find out soon enough. Beneath him, the sun dipped below the horizon, erasing the thin line of his passage. Moving carefully, trying not to dislodge his straining fingertips, he began to cut a hole through the shield barrier. "Report from the Stormtrooper Commander, Admiral," Palaeon called, grimacing as he read it off his comm display. "Skywalker does not appear to be within the cordon." "I'm not surprised," Thrawn said darkly, glowering at his displays. "I've warned intelligence repeatedly about underestimating the range of Skywalker's sensing abilities. Obviously they didn't take me seriously." Palaeon swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. But we know he was there, and he couldn't have gotten very far. The Stormtroopers have established a secondary cordon and begun a building-to-building search." Thrawn took a deep breath, then let it out. "No," he said, his voice even again. "He didn't go into any of the buildings. Not Skywalker. That little diversion of the decoy and the blaster." He looked at Palaeon. "Up, Captain. He went up onto the rooftops." "The spotters are already sweeping that direction," Palaeon said. "If he's up there, they'll spot him." "Good." Thrawn tapped a switch on his command console, calling up a holographic map of that section of the mesa. "What about the shield barrier on the west edge of the cordon? Can it be climbed?" "Our people here say no." Palaeon shook his head. "Too smooth and too sharply angled, with no lip or other barrier at the bottom. If Skywalker went up that side of the street, he's still there. Or at the bottom of the mesa." "Perhaps," Thrawn said. "Assign one of the spotters to search that area anyway." "What about Skywalker's ship?" "Intelligence is still trying to identify which one is his," Palaeon admitted. "There's some problems with the records. We should have it in a few more minutes. Minutes which you no longer have, thanks to their shadower's carelessness," Thrawn bit out. "He's to be demoted 1 grade." "Yes, sir," Palaeon said, logging the order. "A rather severe punishment, but it could have been far worse. The late Lord Vader would have summarily strangled the man. The landing field itself is surrounded, of course." Thrawn rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "A probable waste of time," he said slowly. "On the other hand..." He turned his head to gaze out the viewport at the slowly rotating planet. "Pull them off, Captain," he ordered. "All except the clone troopers. Leave those on guard near the likeliest possibilities for Skywalker's ship." Palaeon blinked. "Sir?" Thrawn turned back to face him, a fresh glint in those glowing red eyes. "The landing field cordon doesn't have nearly enough Yasala Miri to stop a Jedi, Captain, so we won't bother trying. We'll let him get his ship into space and take him with the Chimera." "Yes, sir," Palaeon said, filling his forehead furrow. "But then, why leave the clones?" Thrawn finished for him. "Because while Skywalker is valuable to us, the same is not true of his astromech droid." He smiled slightly. "Unless, of course, Skywalker's heroic efforts to escape Parderus convince it that this is indeed the main conduit for our clone traffic." "Ah," Palaeon said, finally understanding. "In which case we find a way to allow the droid to escape back to the rebellion." "Exactly," Thrawn gestured to Palaeon's board. "Orders, Captain." "Yes, sir." Palaeon turned back to his board, feeling a cautious stirring of excitement as he began issuing the Grand Admiral's commands. Maybe this time Skywalker would finally be theirs. R2 was jabbering nervously when Luke finally charged through the door of their small freighter and slapped the seal behind him. "Everything ready to go?" he shouted over his shoulder to the droid as he hurried to the cockpit alcove. R2 trilled back an affirmative. Luke dropped into the pilot's seat, giving the instruments a quick once-over as he strapped himself in. "Okay," he called back. "Here we go." Throwing power to the repulsor lifts, Luke kicked the freighter clear of the ground, wrenching it hard to starboard. A pair of skip ray blast boats rose with him, moving into a tandem pursuit formation as he headed for the edge of the mesa. "Watch those skip rays, R2, Luke called, splitting his own attention between the rapidly approaching city's edge and the airspace above them. The fight with those clone troopers guarding the landing field had been intense, but had been far too brief to be realistic. Either the Empire had left someone totally incompetent in charge, or they'd let him get to his ship on purpose, carefully herding him into the real trap. The edge of the mesa shot past beneath him. Luke threw a quick glance at the rear display to confirm that he was clear of the city, then punched in the main sublight drive. The freighter shot skyward like a scalded Minoc, leaving the pursuing skip rays flat-footed in its wake. The official sounding orders to halt that had been blaring from the board turned into a surprised yelp as Luke reached over and shut the comm off. R2, you all right back there? The droid chirped in affirmative, and a question scrolled across Luke's computer screen. They were clones all right, he confirmed grimly, an uncomfortable shiver running through him. The strange aura that seemed to surround the Empire's new duplicate humans was twice as eerie up close. I'll tell you something else too, he added to R2. The Imperials knew it was me they were chasing. Those stormtroopers are carrying Isala Miri on their backs. R2 whistled thoughtfully, gave a questioning gargle. Right, that whole Delta Source thing, Luke agreed, reading the droid's comment. Leia told me that if we couldn't get the leak closed fast, she was going to recommend that we move operations out of the Imperial Palace, maybe even off Coruscant entirely. Though if Delta Source was a human or alien spy instead of some impossibly undetectable listening system in the palace itself, moving anywhere would just be so much wasted effort. From R2's rather pointed silence, Luke guessed the droid was thinking that too. The distant horizon, barely visible as dark planet against dark but starlit sky, was starting to show a visible curvature now. Better start calculating our jump to light speed, R2, he called over his shoulder. We're probably going to have to get out of here in a hurry. He got a confirming beat from the droid's position and turned his attention back to the horizon ahead. A whole fleet of Star Destroyers, he knew, could be lurking below that horizon, out of range of his instruments, waiting for him to get too far from any possible cover to launch their attack. Out of range of his instruments, but perhaps not out of range of Jedi senses. Closing his eyes to slits, flooding his mind with calmness, he stretched out through the Force. He got it an instant before R2's startled warning shrill shattered the air. An Imperial Star Destroyer, all right, but not cutting across his path as Luke had expected. Instead, it was coming up from behind, in an atmosphere top-forced orbit that had allowed it to build up speed without sacrificing the advantages of planetary cover. Hang on, Luke shouted, throwing emergency power to the drive, but it was a futile gesture, and both he and the Imperials both knew it. The Star Destroyer was coming up fast, his tractor beams already activated and tracking him. Within a handful of seconds, they were going to get him. Or at least they were going to get the freighter. Luke hit his strap release, opening a disguised panel as he did so and touching the three switches hidden there. The first switch keyed in the limited autopilot, the second unlocked the aft proton torpedo launcher and started it, firing blindly back toward the Star Destroyer. The third activated the freighter self-destruct. His X-Wing was wedged nose forward in the cargo area behind the cockpit alcove, looking for all the world like some strange metallic animal peering out of its burrow. Luke leaped to the open canopy, coming within an ace of cracking his head on the freighter's low ceiling in the process. R2, already snugged into the X-Wing's droid socket, was jabbering softly to himself as he ran the starfighter's systems from standby to full ready. Even as Luke strapped in and pulled on his flight helmet, the droid signaled they were clear to fly. Okay, Luke told him, resting his left hand on the special switch that had been added to his control board. If this is going to work, we're going to have to time it just right. Be ready. Again he closed his eyes, letting the Force flow through his senses. Once before, in his first attempt to locate the Jedi Master Sabaoth, he tangled like this with the Imperials, an X-Wing against an Imperial Star Destroyer. That too had been a deliberate ambush, though he hadn't realized it until Sabaoth's unholy alliance with the Empire had been laid bare. In that battle, skill and luck and the Force had saved him. This time, if the specialists back at Coruscant had done their job right, the luck was already built in. With his mind deeply into the Force, he sensed a lurking of the tractor beam a half-second before it actually occurred. His hand jabbed the switch, and even as the freighter jerked in the tractor beam's powerful grip, the front head blew apart into a cloud of metallic shards. An instant later, kicked forward by a deck-mounted blast booster, the X-Wing shot through the glittering debris. For a long, heart-stopping moment, it seemed as though the tractor beam was going to be able to maintain its hold, despite the obscuring particle fog. Then, all at once, the grip slack-ended and was gone. "We're free!" Luke shouted back at R2, rolling the X-Wing over and driving hard for deep space. "I'm going evasive. Hang on." He rolled the X-Wing again, and as he did so, a pair of brilliant green flashes shot past the transparent steel canopy. With their tractor beams outdistanced, the Imperials had apparently decided to settle for shooting him out of the sky. Another barrage of green flames scorched past, and there was a yelp from R2 as something burned through the deflectors to slap against the X-Wing's underside. Reaching out again to the Force, Luke let it guide his hands on the controls, and then, almost without warning, it was time. Reaching to the hyperdrive lever, Luke pulled it back. With a flicker of pseudo-motion, the X-Wing vanished into the safety of hyperspace, the Chimera's turbo-laser battery still firing uselessly for a second at where it had been. The batteries fell silent, and Palander had a long breath, afraid to look over at Thrawn's command station. It was the second time Skywalker had escaped from this kind of trap, and the last time he'd done so, a man had died for that failure. The rest of the bridge crew hadn't forgotten that either. In the brittle silence, the faint rustling of cloth against seat material was clearly audible as Thrawn stood up. "Well," the Grand Admiral said, his voice strangely calm, "one must give the rebels full credit for ingenuity. I have seen that trick work before, but not nearly so effectively." "Yes, sir," Palaon said, trying without success to hide the strain in his voice. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Thrawn looking at him. "At ease, Captain," the Grand Admiral said soothingly. "Skywalker would have made an interesting package to present to Master Sabaoth, but his escape is hardly cause for major concern. The primary objective of this exercise was to convince the rebellion that they discovered the clone conduit. That objective has been achieved." The tightness in Palaon's chest began to dissipate. If the Grand Admiral wasn't angry about it, that does not mean, however, Thrawn went on, that the actions of the Chimera's crew should be ignored. "Come with me, Captain." Palaon got to his feet, the tightness returning. "Yes, sir." Thrawn led the way to the aft stairway and descended to the starboard crew pit. He walked past the crewers at their consoles, past the officers standing stiffly behind them, and came to a halt at the control station for the starboard tractor beams. "Your name?" he said, quietly to the young man standing at rigid attention there. "Ensign Miffle," the other said, his face pale but composed, the expression of a man facing his death. "Tell me what happened, Ensign." Miffle swallowed. "Sir, I had just established a positive lock on the freighter when it broke up into a cluster of track reflective particles. The targeting system tried to lock on all of them at once and went into a loop snarl. And what did you do?" Sir, I knew that if I waited for the particles to dissipate normally, the target starfighter would be out of range, so I tried to dissipate them myself by shifting the tractor beam into sheer plane mode. It didn't work." A quiet sigh slipped through Miffle's lips. "No, sir. The target lock system couldn't handle it. It froze up completely." "Yes," Thrawn cocked his head slightly. "You've had a few moments now to consider your actions, Ensign. Can you think of anything you should have done instead?" The young man's lip twitched. "No, sir. I'm sorry, but I can't. I don't remember anything in the manual that covers this kind of situation." Thrawn nodded. "Correct," he agreed. "There isn't anything. Several methods have been suggested over the past few decades for counteracting the covert shroud gambit, none of which has ever been made practical. Yours was one of the more innovative attempts, particularly given how little time you had to come up with it. The fact that it failed does not in any way diminish that." A look of cautious disbelief was starting to edge into Miffle's face. "Sir? The Empire needs quick and creative minds, Ensign," Thrawn said. "You're hereby promoted to lieutenant, and your first assignment is to find a way to break a covert shroud. After their success here, the rebellion may try the gambit again." "Yes, sir," Miffle breathed, the colour starting to come back into his face. Thank you, sir. Congratulations, Lieutenant Miffle." Thrawn nodded to him, then turned to Palaon. "The bridge is yours, Captain. Resume our scheduled flight. I'll be in my command room if you require me." "Yes, sir," Palaon managed, and stood there beside the newly minted lieutenant, feeling the stunned awe pervading the bridge as he watched Thrawn leave. Yesterday, the Chimera's crew had trusted and respected the Grand Admiral. After today, they would be ready to die for him. And for the first time in 5 years, Palaon finally knew in the deepest level of his being that the old Empire was gone. The new Empire, with Grand Admiral Thrawn at its head, had been born. The X-Wing hung suspended in the blackness of space, light years away from any solid mass larger than a grain of dust. It was, Luke thought, almost like a replay of that other battle with a Star Destroyer, the one that had left him stranded in deep space and had ultimately led him to Talon Card and Mara Jade and the planet Mirka. Fortunately, appearance was the only thing they had in common, mostly. From the droid socket behind him came a nervous warble. "Come on, R2, relax," Luke soothed him. "It's not that bad. We couldn't have made it anywhere near Coruscant without refueling anyway. We'll just have to do it a little sooner, that's all." The response was a sort of indignant grunt. "I am taking you seriously, R2, Luke said patiently, keying the listing on his nav display over to the droid. "Look, here are all the places we can get to if half our primary power cell's blown out. See?" For a moment the droid seemed to mull over the list. Luke took the opportunity to give it another look himself. There were a lot of choices there, all right. The problem was that many of them wouldn't be especially healthy for a lone New Republic X-Wing to show up at. Half were under direct Imperial control, and most of the others were either leaning that way or keeping their political options open. Still, even on an Imperial-held world, there were sensor gaps a single starfighter could probably slip through. He could put down in some isolated place, make his way on foot to a spaceport, and buy some replacement fuel cells with the Imperial currency he still had left. Getting the cells back to the X-Wing could be a bit of a problem, but nothing he and R2 couldn't solve. R2 chirped a suggestion. "Castle's a possibility," Luke agreed. "I don't know, though. Last I heard, Moff Dul was still in charge there, and Han's never really trusted him. I think we better do with Wilsving, or even..." He broke off as one of the planets on the list caught his eye. a planet Leia had programmed into his onboard nav system, almost as an afterthought, before he left on this mission. Honogare. I've got a better idea, R2, Luke said slowly. Let's go visit the Nograi. There was a startled, disbelieving squawk from behind him. Oh, come on, Luke admonished him. Leia and Chewie went there and got back all right, didn't they? And 3PO too, he added. You don't want 3PO saying you're afraid to go somewhere he wasn't afraid of, would you? R2 grunted again. Doesn't matter whether or not he had a choice, Luke said firmly. The point is that he went. The droid gave a mournful and rather resigned gurgle. That's the spirit, Luke encouraged him, keying the nav computer to start the calculation to Honogare. Leia's been wanting me to go visit them anyway. This way we killed 2 Dune lizards with one throw. R2 gave a single discomforted gurgle and fell silent, and even Luke, who fully trusted Leia's judgment of the Nograi, privately conceded that it was perhaps not the most comforting figure of speech he could have used. The battle data from the Woostry system scrolled to the bottom of the data pad and stopped. I still don't believe it, Leia said, shaking her head as she laid the data pad back down on the table. If the Empire had a superweapon that could shoot through planetary shields, they'd be using it in every system they attacked. It has to be a trick or illusion of some kind. I agree, Mon Mothma said quietly. The question is, how do we convince the rest of the Council and the assemblage of that, not to mention the outer systems themselves? We must solve the puzzle of what happened at Yukio and Woostry, Admiral Akbar said, his voice even more gravelly than usual, and we must solve it quickly. Leia picked up her data pad again, throwing a quick look across the table at Akbar as she did so. The Mon Calamari's huge eyes seemed unusually heavy-lidded, his normal salmon colour noticeably faded. He was tired, desperately so, and if the Empire's grand offensive still rolling toward them across the galaxy, he wasn't likely to be getting much rest anytime soon. Neither were any of the rest of them, for that matter. We already know that Grand Admiral Thrawn has a talent for understanding the minds of his opponents, she reminded the others. Could he have predicted how quickly both the Yukians and the Woostroids would be to surrender? As opposed to, say, the Filvians? Mon Mothma nodded slowly. Interesting point. That might indicate the illusion is one that can't be maintained for very long, or that the power requirements are exceedingly high, Akbar added. If the Empire has learned a method for focusing non-visible energy against a shield, it could conceivably weaken a section long enough to fire a turbo laser blast through the opening. But such a thing would take a tremendous power output, and should also show up as an energy stress on the shield, Mon Mothma pointed out. None of our information suggests that was the case. Our information may be wrong, Akbar retorted. He threw a brief glare at Councillor Borsk failure. Or it may have been manipulated by the Empire, he added pointedly. Such things have happened before. Leia looked at failure too, wondering if the thinly veiled insult to his people would finally drive the boffin out of his self-imposed silence. But failure just sat there, his eyes on the table, his cream-coloured fur motionless, not speaking, not reacting, perhaps not even thinking. Eventually, she supposed, he would regain his verbal courage and a measure of his old political strength. But for now, with his false denunciation of Akbar still fresh in everyone's minds, he was in the middle of his species' version of penance. Leia's stomach tightened in frustration. Once again, the boffin's inflexible all-or-nothing approach to politics was running squarely counter to the New Republic's best interests. A few months earlier, Failur's accusations against Akbar had wasted valuable time and energy. Now, when the Council needed every bit of insight and resourcefulness he could muster, including Failur's, he was playing the silent martyr. There were days and long dark nights when Leia privately despaired of ever holding the New Republic together. You're right, of course, Admiral, Mon Mothma said with a sigh. We need more information, and we need it quickly. Talon Card's organization is still our best chance, Leia said. They've got the contacts, both here and on the Imperial side. From what Luke said in his last message, Card sounded interested. We can't afford to wait on the convenience of a smuggler, Akbar growled, his mouth tendrils stiffening with distaste. What about General Bel Iblis? He was fighting alone against the Empire for several years. The General has already turned his intelligence contacts over to us, Mon Mothma said, muscling her cheek twitching. So far, we're still integrating them into our own system. I wasn't referring to his contacts, Akbar said. I meant the General himself. Why isn't he here? Leia looked at Mon Mothma, her stomach tightening again. Garn Bel Iblis had been one of the early forces behind the consolidation of individual resistance units into the all-encompassing Rebel Alliance, and for years had formed a shadowy triad of leadership with Mon Mothma and Leia's own adoptive father, Bail Organa. But when Organa died with his people in the Death Star's attack on Alderaan, and as Mon Mothma began subsequently to draw more and more power to herself, Bail Iblis had left the Alliance and struck out on his own. Since then, he had continued his private war against the Empire, until almost by accident he had crossed paths with fellow Corellian Han Solo. It was Han's urgent request that had brought Bail Iblis and his force of 6 dreadnoughts to the New Republic's aid at the Katana battle. Mon Mothma, speaking words
about burying past differences, had welcomed Beliblis back, and had then turned around and sent him to bolster the defences in the outer sectors of the New Republic, as far from Coruscant as he could possibly have gone. Leia was not yet ready to ascribe vindictiveness to Mon Mothma's decision, but there were others in the New Republic hierarchy who remembered Beliblis and his tactical genius. Not all of them were quite so willing to give Mon Mothma the benefit of the doubt. The General's expertise is needed at the battlefront, Mon Mothma said evenly. His expertise is also needed here, Akbar retorted, but Leia could hear the resignation in his voice. Akbar himself had just returned from a tour of the Farfin and Dolomar defences and would be leaving in the morning for Dantooine. With the Imperial war machine on the move, the New Republic couldn't afford the luxury of bearing their best line commanders away in groundside of officers. I understand your concerns, Mon Mothma said, more gently. When we get the situation out there stabilized, I fully intend to bring General Beliblis back and put him in charge of tactical planning. If we get the situation stabilized, Leia amended silently, again feeling her stomach tighten. So far, the offensive was going uniformly the Empire's way. The thought broke off in mid-stride, a sudden belated awareness flooding in on her. No, it wasn't her stomach that was tightening. Akbar was speaking again. Excuse me, Leia cut him off, getting carefully to her feet. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to get down to medical. Mon Mothma's eyes widened. The twins? Leia nodded. I think they're on their way. The walls and ceiling of the birth room were a warm tan colour, with a superimposed series of shifting lights that had been synchronised with Leia's own brainwave patterns. Theoretically, it was supposed to help her relax and concentrate. As a practical matter, Leia had already decided that after 10 hours of looking at it, the technique had pretty well lost its effectiveness. Another contraction came, the hardest one yet. Automatically, Leia reached out with the Force, using the methods Luke had taught her to hold off the pain coming from protesting muscles. If nothing else, this whole birth process was giving her the chance to practice her Jedi techniques, and not just those having to do with pain control. It's all right, she thought soothingly toward the small minds within her. It's all right. Mother's here. It didn't really help. Caught in forces they couldn't comprehend, their tiny bodies being squeezed and pushed as they were driven slowly toward the unknown, their undeveloped minds were fluttering with fear. Though to be perfectly fair, their father wasn't in much better shape. You all right? Han asked for the umpteenth time since they'd come in here. He squeezed her hand a little more tightly, and also for the umpteenth time, in sympathetic tension of her hunching shoulders. I'm still fine, Leia assured him. Her shoulders relaxed as the contraction entered, and she gave his hand a squeeze in return. You don't look so good, though. Han made a face at her. It's past my bedtime, he said dryly. That must be it, Leia agreed. Han had been as nervous as a tauntaun on ball bearings ever since the labour started in earnest, but he was making a manly effort not to show it. More for her sake, Leia suspected, than for any damage such an admission might do to his image. Sorry. Don't worry about it. Han threw a look to the side, where the medic and 2 AMD droids are hovering around the business end of the birth bed. Looks like we're getting close, sweetheart. Count on it, Leia agreed. The last word strangled off as another contraction took her attention. Oh. Han's anxiety level jumped another notch. You all right? Leia nodded, throat muscles momentarily too tight to speak through. Hold me, Han, she breathed when she could talk again. Just hold me. I'm right here, he said quietly, sliding his free hand into a comfortable grip under her shoulder. She hardly heard him. Deep within her, the small lives that she and Han had created were starting to move, and abruptly their fluttering fear had become full-blown terror. Don't be afraid, she thought at them. Don't be afraid. It'll be all right. I'm here. Soon you'll be with me. She wasn't really expecting a reaction. The twins' minds are far too undeveloped to understand anything as abstract as words or the concept of future events. But she continued anyway, wrapping them in their fear as best she could in her love and peace and comfort. There was another contraction. The inexorable movement toward the outside world continued, and then, to Leia's everlasting joy, one of the tiny minds reached back to her, touching her in a way that neither twin had ever responded to her nonverbal caresses before. The rising fear slowed in its advance, and Leia had the sudden mental image of a baby's hand curled tightly around her finger. Yes, she told the infant, I'm your mother, and I'm here. The tiny mind seemed to consider that. Leia continued her assurances, and the mind shifted a little away from her as if the infant's attention had been drawn somewhere else. A good sign, she decided, if it was able to be distracted from what was happening to it. Then to her amazement, the second mind's panic also began to fade. The second mind, which to the best of her knowledge had not yet even noticed her presence. Later, in retrospect, the whole thing would seem obvious, if not completely inevitable, but at that moment the revelation was startling enough to send a shiver through the core of Leia's soul. The twins, growing together in the Force, even as they'd grown together within her, had somehow become attuned to each other, attuned in a way and to a depth that Leia knew she herself would never entirely share. It was at the same time one of the proudest and yet one of the most poignant moments of Leia's life, to get such a glimpse into the future, to see her children growing and strengthening themselves in the Force, and to know that there would be a part of their lives together that she would never share. The contraction eased, the grand and bittersweet vision of the future fading into a small nugget of ache in the corner of her mind, an ache that was made all the worse by the private shame that, in all of that flood of selfish emotion, it hadn't even occurred to her that Han would be able to share even less of their lives than she would. And suddenly, through the mental haze, a bright light seemed to explode in her eyes. Reflexively, she clutched harder at Han's hand. "What? It's coming!" Han yelped, gripping back. "First one's halfway out." Leia blinked, the half-imagined light vanishing as her mind fumbled free of her contact with her children whose eyes had never had to deal with anything brighter than a dim, diffuse glow. "Turn that light down," she gasped. "It's too bright. The children's eyes—" "It's all right," the medic assured her. "Their eyes will adjust." "All right, one last push." And then, seemingly without warning, the first part was suddenly over. "Got one," Han told her, his voice suddenly sounding strangely breathless. He craned his neck. "It's our daughter." He looked back at Leia, the tension in his face plastered over with the lopsided grin she knew so well. "Jaina." Leia nodded. "Jaina," she repeated. Somehow the names they'd decided on had never sounded quite the same as they did right now. "What about Jason?" "Offhand, I'd say he's anxious to join his sister," the medic said dryly. "Get ready to push. He looks like he's trying to crawl out on his own." "Okay. Push." Leia took a deep breath. Finally, after 10 hours of labour, after 9 months of pregnancy, the end was finally in sight. No, not the end. The beginning. They laid the twins in her arms a few minutes later, and as she looked first at them and then up at Han, she felt a sense of utter peace settle over her. Out among the stars there might be a war going on, but for here and for now, all was right with the universe. "Watch it, Rogue Leader," the voice of Rogue 10 snapped in Wedge's ear. "You've picked up a tail." "Got it," Wedge told him, cutting his X-Wing hard over. But TIE Interceptor shot past, spitting laser fire as he went, and he attempted to match Wedge's maneuver. Blowing him barely half a second behind the Imperial, a pursuing X-Wing blew him into a cloud of flaming dust. "Thanks, Rogue 8, Wedge said, blowing a drop of sweat from the tip of his nose and checking his scanners. Temporarily, at least, it looked like their little corner of the melee was in the clear. Putting his X-Wing into a slow turn, he gave the overall battle scene a quick assessment. It was worse than he'd feared. Worse, for that matter, than it had been even 5 minutes ago. 2 more Victory-class Star Destroyers had appeared from hyperspace, dropping into mauling position at point-blank range from one of their free remaining Calamari Star Cruisers. And at the rate the Star Destroyers were pouring turbo-laser fire into it, "Rogue Squadron, change course to 22 Mark 8, he ordered, turning onto the intercept heading and wondering how in blazes the Imperials had managed this one. Making so precise a jump was difficult under ideal circumstances. To do so into the heat and confusion of a battle should have been well nigh impossible. Just one more example of the Empire's incredible new talent for coordinating their forces. There was a warning twitter from the astromech droid riding in the socket behind him. They were now registering too close to a large mass to jump to light speed. Wedge glanced around with a frown. Finally spotted the interdictor cruiser hovering off in the distance, keeping well out of the main battle itself. Apparently the Imperials didn't want any of the New Republic ships sneaking out of the party early. Dead ahead, some of the Victory Star Destroyers' TIE fighters were sweeping up to meet them. "Porkins formation," Wedge ordered his team. "Watch out for flankers. Star Cruiser Orphavan, this is Rogue Squadron. We're coming in. Stay there, Rogue Leader," a gravelly Mon Calamari voice said. "We're too badly overmatched. You can't help us." Wedge gritted his teeth. The Mon Cal was probably right. "We're going to try anyway," he told the other. "The advancing TIE fighters are almost in range now." "Hang on. Rogue Squadron, this is Bell Iblis," a new voice cut in. "Break off your attack. On my mark, cut 30 degrees to port side." With an effort, Wedge suppressed the urge to say something that would probably have earned him a court-martial. On his list, as long as the ship was in one piece, there was still hope of saving it. Apparently the great General Bell Iblis had decided otherwise. "Copy, General," he sighed. "Rogue Squadron, stand by. Rogue Squadron, mark." Obediently, reluctantly, Wedge swung his X-Wing to the side. The TIE fighters shifted course to follow, seemed to suddenly get flustered, and with a roar that carried clearly, even through the tenuous gases of interplanetary space, an assault formation of A-Wings shot through the space Rogue Squadron had just exited. The TIE fighters, already in motion to match the X-Wing's maneuver, were caught flat-footed. Before they could get back into barricade position, the A-Wings were past them, heading at full throttle for the embattled Star Cruiser. "Okay, Rogue Squadron," Bell Iblis said. "Your turn. Clear their backs for them." Wedge grinned tightly. He should have known better of Bell Iblis. "Copy, General. Rogue Squadron, let's take them." "And then," Bell Iblis added grimly, "prepare to retreat." Wedge blinked, the grin fading. Retreat? Turning his X-Wing toward the TIE fighters, he looked back at the main battle area. A few minutes earlier, he'd realized the situation had looked bad. Now it was on the edge of disaster. Bell Iblis's force was down to barely 2/3 of the 15 capital ships he'd started with most of those huddled into a last-ditch bastion formation. Surrounding it, systematically battering in its defenses, were over 20 Star Destroyers and Dreadnoughts. Wedge looked back at the approaching TIE fighters, and beyond them to the interdictor cruiser. The interdictor cruiser, whose gravity well projectors were keeping the beleaguered battle force from escaping to light speed. And then they were on the TIE fighters, and there was no more time for thought. The battle was sharp, but short. The sudden appearance of the A-Wings from Rogue Squadron's shadow had apparently thrown the TIE fighters just enough off stride. 3 minutes, maybe 4, and Rogue Squadron was again in the clear. "What now, Rogue Leader?" Rogue 2 asked as the squadron reformed through the debris. Mentally crossing his fingers, Wedge looked back at the Orphavan. If Beliblus's gamble hadn't worked, it had. The A-Wing slasher distracted the Victory Star Destroyer's attack just enough for the Star Cruiser to catch its breath and go back on the offensive. The Orphavan had both its extensive turbolaser and ion cannon batteries going, scrambling the Imperial systems and pummeling away at their hulls. Even as Wedge watched, a geyser of superheated gas erupted from the midsection of the nearest Star Destroyer, sending the ship rotating ponderously away. Pulling under the derelict's hull, the Star Cruiser moved away from the battle and headed for the interdictor cruiser. "Change course for the Orphavan," Wedge ordered. "They may need backup." The words were barely out of his mouth when, shooting in from light speed, a pair of dreadnoughts suddenly appeared at the Orphavan's flank. Wedge held his breath, but the Star Cruiser was already moving too fast for the dreadnoughts to get more than a wild shot at it. He passed them without pausing, and as they turned to follow it, the A-Wing squadron reenacted their earlier slash maneuver. Once again, the distraction's effectiveness was vastly out of proportion to the actual damage inflicted. By the time the starfighters broke off, the Orphavan was beyond any chance the dreadnoughts might have to catch up, and the Imperials knew it. Behind Wedge, the astromech droid beeped. The pseudo-gravity field was fading away as the distant interdictor cruiser shut down its gravity well projectors in preparation for its own escape to light speed. The interdictor cruiser, and belatedly the explanation struck him. He'd been wrong. Those Victory Star Destroyers hadn't needed to rely on any half-mystical coordination technique to jump in so close to the Star Cruiser. All it had to do was fly in along a hyperspace vector supplied to them by the interdictor cruiser and wait until the edge of the gravity well cone yanked them back into normal space. Wedge felt his lip twist. Overestimating the enemy's abilities, he'd been taught a long time ago, could be just as dangerous as underestimating them. It was a lesson he would have to start remembering. "Interdictor gravity field is down," Beliblus's voice came in his ear. "All units, acknowledge and prepare to retreat on your marks." "Rogue Squadron, copy," Wedge said, grimacing as he turned onto their pre-planned escape vector and looked back at what was left of the main battle group. There was no doubt about it. They'd been beaten, and beaten badly, and about all Beliblus's legendary tactical skill had been able to do had been to keep the defeat from turning into a rout, and the price was likely to be yet another system lost to the Empire. "Rogue Squadron, go. Copy," Wedge sighed, and pulled back the hyperspace lever, and as the stars fled into star lines, a sobering thought occurred to him. For the foreseeable future, at least, underestimating the Empire was not likely to be all that much of a problem.